Hello and welcome to Quiet Hours, a place where the world slows down and mysterious stories fill the silence of the night. Before we begin, make sure you're comfortable and ready to relax. And if you enjoy these relaxing horror stories, don't forget to like the video and subscribe. Now, let the quiet take over and the story begin. I remember the night vividly. My friend Olga and I had been scheming for months to find a chance to go ghost hunting together. And at last, I found a babysitter for my son that would free me up for the evening. Our plan was to explore 3 allegedly haunted places in the area, with the infamous Jericho Covered Bridge as our major destination. The Jericho Bridge, built in 1865, is one of the few original covered bridges left in Maryland. It spans a small creek in Harford County, connecting a narrow country road. About a mile north is a historic mill and old village, and local lore says multiple deaths happened near the bridge, plus rumors of animal sacrifices and satanic rituals performed in the woods between the village and the bridge. If you follow a trail into that wooded clearing, you can still see marks on the trees. Another rumor claims that if you stop on the middle of the bridge after midnight, turn off your car, flash your headlights 3 times, and beep your horn thrice, you'll see someone hanging from the rafters in your rearview mirror. I had never tested that rumor personally. Every time I'd driven through, I already felt edgy enough just from the energy of the place. So that night, Olga picked me up at around 10. We were both excited, but also a little wary. We grabbed Alicia, another friend, and set off to our first location, a large plantation and manor house maybe 20 minutes away. The place was private property, with a long quarter-mile driveway that stretched back from a fence by the main road. We parked near the fence, but noticed some neighbors nearby who might see us trespassing, so we didn't dare continue. We didn't want trouble. In short order, we left and decided to head straight to Jericho Bridge instead. We arrived near the historic village, which had a small lot where we could park, and from there we planned to walk on foot down Jericho Road to the bridge. It felt more adventurous than doing the car trick, but it was also quite dark outside. The hour wasn't terribly late, maybe around 11, but I worried about oncoming traffic more than ghosts, since Jericho Road is an actual public route. The road is only partially lit. There's a street light near the village intersection, plus a couple of new lights by each end of the bridge. The stretch in between stays pretty dark, so we lit our way with our phones. As we strolled, we heard typical night sounds. Crickets, the breeze through leaves, small rustlings. Even so, the place had a tense vibe. Then, as we neared the northern entrance of the bridge, where a light stands, I felt a shift in the air. Olga said she felt something, too. The strangest part was that suddenly we could see our breath hanging in front of our faces, like on a cold day. But this was late August, and it had been around 80 degrees. There was no earthly reason for anyone's breath to condense. Plus, Alicia couldn't see hers. Only Olga and I saw visible breath, which gave me the impression the spirit activity was focusing on the 2 of us. Inside the bridge, the atmosphere felt more complicated. I picked up on multiple presences, but they weren't threatening at first. In fact, they felt playful, curious. I even sensed someone or something trailing behind me, as though a phantom figure hovered over my shoulder. I got all the way to the middle of the bridge, and abruptly, the energy shifted from mild to menacing, like a jolt of warning in my mind. I heard an internal message. You need to go, and you need to go now. I tried to ignore it for a second, but the feeling only intensified. I stepped out to the south entrance, and was hit by a wave of dizziness, almost faintness. It was like stepping into a vortex. The moment my senses cleared, I felt a strong, dark force nearby, far more negative than anything I'd felt on the other side. Just then, the 3 of us heard humming. It sounded like a human hum, coming from beneath the bridge. Confused, we tried to film or record audio on our phones, but we couldn't get sound on any of our videos or voice recorders. It was as though something was muting the devices. Olga peered over the stone wall to see if someone was actually down in the creek bed, then said, "I think I see someone down there." At that point, alarm bells rang in my head. I told her we had to leave immediately, because I got the sense that this presence was truly dark. Meanwhile, Olga was pointing to something in the darkness, stammering, "Do you see that?" I said, "No, but I can feel it." We all started running back along the road to the car. We'd barely gotten past a small trail leading into the woods when a whisper, childlike but undeniably sinister, spoke. "Come with me." All three of us froze in our tracks, eyes wide. Olga asked, "You heard that?" We all said yes. We tried not to panic, but our pace quickened. Then Olga, in front of me, gasped in pain. She bent down, pulling up the leg of her leggings to reveal 3 fresh, bloody scratches on the back of her ankle. I moved to help her, but at that moment her key fob, attached to her lanyard by a new climbing carabiner, just flew off and landed about 6 feet away. We had no time to question how that was possible. We scooped it up and sprinted to the car, noticing that the entire walk back, Olga and I still saw our breath in puffs of fog, while Alicia remained unaffected. It was as though the cold presence had followed us right up to the door, only letting go once we got inside and started the engine. Despite the initial plan to hit 3 places, we were so shaken that by the time we arrived at the final destination, a historic mansion, we couldn't focus. We circled the mansion's perimeter once, half-heartedly looked around, then left. We were done for the night. A few days later, I shared the story with a client of mine, who also had an interest in paranormal phenomena. She told me that back in the 80s or 90s, there had supposedly been a coven of witches who performed a ritual at Jericho Bridge to keep some malevolent entity contained. They'd carved or drawn symbols on the floorboards and near the entrances. However, in 2015, the bridge was refurbished, and those old pieces of wood bearing protective markings were replaced, freeing whatever was trapped. It was a chilling explanation that fit too neatly with our unnerving encounter. Months later, on Memorial Day the following year, my fiancé, then my boyfriend, and I visited a park near that same historic village for a daytime picnic. The place had a few trails, one of which led from the old mill all the way to Jericho Bridge, winding through scenic woods along the creek. Since it was broad daylight, I thought we'd be safe to explore. We started hiking, the weather bright and the trail peaceful at first, but maybe 15 minutes in, a heavy sense of dread overcame me. My chest tightened, and my nerves stood on edge. The fiancé noticed my discomfort and asked if I was okay. I said we needed to turn around. I just knew going forward would be a mistake. We never even saw the bridge from that trail. We left, my heart pounding, certain that the same dark energy that attacked us at night lingered there, even in daylight. To this day, whenever I think about Jericho-covered bridge, I recall that wave of sickness, the childlike whisper in the woods, and the black mass that seemed to radiate malevolence. Even more, I remember Olga crying out in pain, discovering those 3 scratches, and seeing her key fob fling itself off her lanyard. It was enough to convince me that the place holds more than just local ghost stories. There's something truly dangerous at Jericho Bridge. If the witch's protective spell was undone by the bridge's renovations, it's likely free to roam that area now, lurking in the shadows. I haven't gone back at night since. Even thinking about it stirs up a mild panic, the memory of that sour feeling that told me, "Go now." Some skeptics might say we had overactive imaginations, but you can't explain the key fob flying off, or how we all heard the same disembodied voice, or why Olga got scratched with no rational cause. When it comes to ghostly legends, I usually try to keep an open mind but remain cautious. With Jericho Bridge, though, I'm fully convinced there's a presence, and not a friendly one, waiting after dark for unwary explorers who might be enticed by the local legends. For me, that knowledge is enough. I won't tempt fate by returning, because sometimes these stories are more than just rumors. I remember that evening with a clarity that still makes my heart race whenever I think about it. I was in my final year of high school, and like many older students, I was roped into volunteering for a special event for incoming kids. Every year, the school organized these fun activities to help newcomers get to know one another and ease the tension of a brand new environment. It was the sort of event that ran well into the evening, with games and laughter filling the hallways. By the time everything wrapped up, the younger students were ushered into the gym with their sleeping bags to settle down for the night. Us volunteers, however, had a different job, cleaning up the mess left behind across the sprawling campus. Our school was bigger than what you might imagine for a smallish community. Two large buildings formed the main part of the campus, each with multiple floors, and a covered bridge connected them. The interior had long corridors with rows of lockers and windows overlooking courtyards or lawns. It was a place that felt alive during the day, always bustling with students scurrying from one class to another, cramming textbooks into bags, or chatting about trivial dramas. But that night, most rooms stood silent, the overhead lights switched off in many sections. The building took on an eerie calm when stripped of the usual daytime chaos. In the back of my mind, I was aware that being at school so late was unsettling. Yet I kept telling myself that it was all in my head, that these big, echoing halls were only ominous because I wasn't used to seeing them empty. I had left my phone in a classroom where we volunteers had kept our belongings, so I couldn't rely on the flashlight feature if I needed it. This was a bit of a problem because the corridors were long, and each section of lights had to be turned on or off with a switch placed at intervals along the walls. The plan, we decided, was to split up and tackle the leftover mess scattered around different corners of the campus. Some volunteers headed toward the cafeteria, others to the assembly hall, some to random classrooms, and I ended up assigned to the chapel area. The presence of a chapel might seem unusual, but our school had a bit of a tradition. Although not everyone was religious, the space was there for quiet reflection, occasional events, and whatnot. Usually, it felt like any other room. Carpeted floors, rows of chairs, and a small altar. The difference that night was that everything was dark and hushed. I trudged alone down a hallway leading to the chapel, turning lights on as I went. Behind me, each corridor I'd come from slipped back into darkness as I progressed, because we were expected to turn lights off once we were done. My steps echoed in the silence. With each flick of a switch, a row of bulbs fizzled out behind me, leaving that stretch of hallway black. Inside, my imagination started acting up. It was the kind of sensation you get when your back is turned and you're sure something is creeping behind you. I tried to ignore it, focusing on the practical tasks. Pick up leftover items, fold and stack any chairs, check for dropped bits of paper from the day's activities. But the looming hush pressed in on me. I missed the usual scene of people scurrying around, music playing over speakers, or even the sound of some teacher lecturing a straggling student to hurry along. At last, I reached the door to the chapel. Because it was built in a slightly older style, with wooden doors and stained glass windows, it had an old-fashioned vibe that could be charming during the day but felt unnerving under flickering evening lights. I tried the handle and let myself in. To my dismay, the place was pitch black, and I had no idea where the light switch was. The only reason I could see anything at all was the faint glow from the hallway behind me. I realized I'd be stumbling around if I stepped too far inside. Luckily, as soon as I scanned the floor near the doorway, I saw some items that we volunteers had left there earlier, probably props or materials for a game. I bent down, gathered them in my arms, and decided there was no point lingering if I didn't have a flashlight. I'd intended to do a more thorough job, but in that moment, I felt the weight of the dark space pressing on me. The quicker I got out, the better. After scooping up the stuff, I backed out, quietly shutting the chapel door behind me. I drew a breath, relieved that I could still see the lit hallway outside. But as I locked up, an odd sensation prickled at my nerves, something that told me not to get too comfortable. I rationalized it as typical imagination. All those nightmarish scenes in movies featuring deserted school corridors, flickering lights, strange shapes lurking behind corners. Yet a disquiet lingered in my chest. I exhaled, turned away from the chapel, and took a step. Suddenly, the overhead lights in that section died with a silent flick. My head whipped around to see if a colleague might be playing a prank. The corridor behind me was dark, but I could make out that the lights further down in the distance were still on. Nothing else moved. A chill danced along my spine. My arms tightened around the bundle of objects I was carrying. This was the moment my sense of calm began to unravel. I told myself not to panic, that maybe someone was toggling switches in another part of the building. The sense of isolation, though, felt heavier now. I forced myself to keep walking. My mission wasn't over. Because each volunteer was tasked with making sure no lights were left on in an area after finishing up, I had to continue turning them off behind me. So I walked forward into the partially lit corridor, heading for the next switch. My footsteps seemed far too loud. Each time my shoes squeaked on the tile floor, my heart thumped faster. Eventually, I reached the next switch, which controlled the lights in the hallway I just traversed. With a flick, those bulbs winked out. Now the darkness behind me felt denser than ever, as though it had a tangible weight, pressing up against my back. I told myself not to look back. If I turned, my mind might conjure illusions, shapes in the shadows that would only intensify my fear. I took another step forward, desperate to maintain composure. Then it happened. I heard a door slam shut in the darkness behind me, a sharp, resonant bang that practically jolted me from head to toe. My stomach flipped. No teacher or volunteer should have been in that hallway. We had all parted ways, and anyway, no doors around here should be opening or shutting with such force. Before I could even fully process the shock, a distinct noise followed. Footsteps. Not just any footsteps. These were quick, pounding footfalls echoing through the corridor, closing in my direction. Someone or something was running right at me. Fear shot like electricity through my limbs. My instincts flared, and I took off, sprinting forward with my heart hammering. The building's hallway layout forced me to keep a specific path if I wanted to exit the building. I was still obligated, foolishly perhaps, to switch off the lights as I went. An odd sense of duty or maybe just a reflex hammered into me. So even in flight, I slapped each switch I passed, my breath hitching with nervous laughter. Yes, I was weirdly giggling, as if my brain decided that was the appropriate response to being chased in a dark school corridor. The entire scenario felt surreal, like something out of a half-baked horror script. But it was happening, and I was aware of every second. I refused to glance behind me. Not only was I terrified of whatever might be gaining on me, but I also feared that slowing for even a moment might allow it to catch up. The clatter of footsteps in pursuit reverberated in my ears. Darkness trailed behind me, growing with each switch I shut off. My lungs burned as I forced myself to keep running, navigating corners by memory. Usually, that building's hallways felt endless during regular school days, but that night, they seemed to stretch on forever, each meter of hallway an obstacle to get past. Then, at last, I reached the bridge that connected Building B to Building A. My plan was to head to the classroom where the other volunteers were gathered, which was in Building A. The moment I barreled onto that bridge, the noise behind me stopped as if cut by a knife. No more pounding footsteps, no more sense of anything close. The hush returned, the only sound my own panting. The lights on that enclosed walkway were always left on, so I didn't need to turn anything off. I dared to slow my pace, glancing over my shoulder. That unbroken darkness of the corridor lay still, as if no one had ever been there. My heart hammered, and sweat trickled down my back. I was half expecting a shape to materialize, but it never did. Shoulders tense, I pressed forward and hurried into Building A. My only thought was to find the other volunteers, to confirm no one was pranking me. I followed the corridor to the classroom we had used as our base. There I found them all. They were sprawled out with their snacks or finishing the night's tasks, chatting about the day. The moment one noticed me, they asked, "Where have you been? We started to worry you got lost." Another pointed out that I looked pale. "Are you okay?" I tried to regain composure, swallowing the lump in my throat. "Hey, was anyone else in Building B just now?" My voice must have shaken because they shot me puzzled looks. One volunteer answered, "No, not at all. Once you left, we realized we were all assigned to different areas. Building B is mostly your territory right now." "Why?" I scanned their faces. No one looked sweaty or out of breath. No one seemed giddy from a successful prank. They were all honestly confused by my question. Then I realized there was no way they could have reached the classroom before me anyway, since the enclosed bridge was the only direct route between the two buildings. If someone had pranked me, they'd still be behind me, forced to cross that same bridge. I would have seen them or they'd come in later, panting. But everyone was already settled, calm, and obviously had been for a while. I didn't offer many details. "No reason," I mumbled. "Just thought maybe someone else was over there." They kept pressing, but I shrugged it off, not really wanting to admit I'd fled from phantom footsteps. A swirl of relief and confusion filled me. I stayed with them, double-checking if they needed any help. Inside, I couldn't stop replaying the moment the door slammed and the chase started. My mind flicked to all the typical rational answers. A draft causing a door to bang, or some piece of equipment dropping. But the footsteps, that was harder to rationalize. Could it have been my imagination conjuring illusions in a quiet corridor? Possibly, but everything sounded so real, so distinct, that I can't neatly dismiss it. The rest of the night ended uneventfully. Eventually, we all went home. For a long time, I remained haunted by the question. Had I turned around in that corridor, what might I have seen? A figure? Darkness shaped like a human silhouette? Or nothing at all, while my ears played tricks on me? The memory is vivid. The overhead lights flicking off in sections, the sudden door slam, the pounding footsteps echoing in the hallway, and me racing to flick each switch as I went. Even recalling it makes my chest tighten. After that incident, I vowed never to volunteer to stay late at the school again. When I told a couple of close friends about my story, they tried to guess what caused it. One said maybe a teacher was working late, got spooked themselves, and ran. Another insisted it had to be a prank. A third friend suggested maybe the building's old pipes or some mechanical system caused the banging. But none of those explanations account for the distinct chasing footsteps, especially how they kept pace with me until I hit the bridge. And nobody can explain how it all abruptly ceased the moment I stepped into the lit walkway. It was as though crossing that threshold ended the pursuit. In truth, I never found a definite explanation. The school is old, but it's not known for ghost stories. Nothing in its history suggests a tragic accident or any reason for a haunting. Teachers, staff, and students typically only mention how big it is and how easy it is to get lost. But for me, that one night introduced a dimension of fear I'd never associated with those hallways before. Even now, whenever I happen to pass through the corridor near the chapel on a quiet day, I get a faint echo of that unease. Light or no light, a small part of me braces for the possibility of hearing sudden footsteps approach from behind. I sometimes wonder if, had I turned around, I would have seen nothing. Maybe my own mind painted the chase to match my rising anxiety in that dark environment. Alternatively, maybe something intangible truly lurked in the shadows. I'll never know for sure. The only thing I do know is that I've never felt such a rush of fear in a place that, by day, seems perfectly ordinary. The memory serves as a reminder that the mind, or maybe the building itself, can produce unexpected illusions or truths once night falls and the lights go out. I continue to go about my days, fulfilling the usual routines, rarely thinking about that moment. But once in a while, if I'm out late or find myself alone in a quiet hallway anywhere, I sense a flicker of that old dread. My skin prickles and I walk just a little faster, resisting the urge to glance over my shoulder, because a part of me still fears that if I do, I might glimpse something or nothing at all, but the terror that it could be there remains. That single experience overshadowed all the mundane tasks we did that night, so thoroughly that I can't even recall what items I retrieved from the chapel or which game had been played there earlier. The event replaced those details in my memory, dominating the mental reel of that particular evening. It's strange how a place usually so full of noise and life can become so intimidating when its inhabitants are gone. A hallway designed for daily traffic, lockers, posters, and chatter can turn into a corridor of potential horrors once you're isolated in it. And in the end, I have to accept that some occurrences don't have tidy answers. I remain certain that I wasn't imagining the footsteps, but I can't prove what caused them, nor can I prove I didn't conjure them from stress. At this point, it hardly matters. The fear felt real enough to shape my aversion to late-night volunteering. That single chase, real or not, was enough to keep me from being the last person in a dark building ever again. So that's the story. One moment I'm cleaning up in a school chapel. The next I'm hurtling down the corridor, switching off lights and being pursued by footsteps in the dark. I ended the night safe, unscathed, yet deeply unnerved. And to this day, I occasionally recall that final question. What would I have seen if I'd turned around? Part of me is glad I never found out. Another part remains curious, half hoping it might have been nothing at all, and half expecting it might have been something I wasn't prepared to face. I was about 11 years old when my family moved into a rural area that seemed to be in the early stages of turning into a suburban development. There were horse farms and ranches that had been there for well over a century, but they sat right next to a newly built gated community, with a tall wall running along the boundary line. From our property, I could see gleaming new houses on the other side of that wall, and it always struck me as strange to have such a contrast between the old and the new so close together. I'd sometimes watch the neighbors in their modern two-story homes while across the street, there was a ranch that looked like it belonged in another era. A short distance away, maybe a couple of properties over, a new park had been built. Its centerpiece was a playground with a tall slide and some swings, next to a fenced hockey rink and a couple of covered picnic shelters. There were also restrooms, which the county must have installed around the same time. Beyond that, there was a broad grassy field, then a band of woods that marked the park's back boundary. They'd paved a quarter-mile loop of jogging path that curved in and out of the treeline, and you could see folks from the subdivision come out through a gate in their wall to use the park. I spent plenty of afternoons there, running around in the field or exploring the edges of the woods. Even in daylight, though, those woods carried an odd sense of mystery, as though they guarded old secrets from the 1800s. There were stories about how the region had been active during the Seminole Wars, with a few small forts dotted around, but I never gave that much thought until later. You see, we'd catch glimpses sometimes. A shape moving at the tree's edge, or a fleeting shadow among the trunks. The wind would blow through the branches in the evenings, and I'd feel a heaviness in the air, like the woods wanted me to stay out. It was spooky, but never enough to keep me completely away. Then, everything changed when one of the local boys discovered a grave. He was older than me by a bit and lived up the same dirt road. One day, he ventured deep into those woods behind the park and found an old barbed wire fence. Being curious, he hopped over it and stumbled upon the crumbled remains of a barn hidden in thick undergrowth. And in a clearing within that ring of trees, he found a gravesite, a marker for a settler who had died in the Seminole Wars era. The poor man had sent his family away for safety while he stayed to fight, and was apparently killed. His comrades also died, so no one was left to record the burial location. It had been lost for over a century until that boy happened upon it. Naturally, this discovery became local news, with a picture of the old tombstone in the newspaper. Unfortunately, it wasn't long before vandals decided to mess with the grave, scrawling graffiti or worse. That's when the real troubles began. At first, it was just small things, like the sudden surge of snakes. We'd see a black racer or a rat snake from time to time before, but now we were spotting venomous cottonmouths all over. Each week, we'd run into several, slithering far closer to our homes than usual. Then the crows came, perching on the power lines every morning, cawing and shrieking incessantly. It seemed as though the environment itself was shifting, becoming unsettled. An early chill set in that September, and almost every night we'd get a thick mist that wouldn't burn off until late morning. That mist lingered near the woods, draping the treeline in a gauzy white, so you couldn't see more than a few feet in. Sometimes, I'd swear I saw the outline of something large and dog-like moving within that haze, its head low to the ground, sniffing around, but I could never get a clear view. All of it culminated in a sort of oppressive atmosphere. Fewer kids ventured out to the park. Parents, too, felt uneasy, though they wouldn't admit exactly why. My cousins happened to be living with us at that time. They were waiting for a double-wide trailer to be set up on the back portion of our property. In the meantime, they slept in the main house with us. One night, my older cousin, who shared a room with my brother, got fed up with my brother's late-night video gaming on his new PlayStation. Hoping to find peace and quiet, he grabbed his blankets and pillows and trudged across the yard in the dark to that trailer, intending to crash in it even though it still lacked electricity and running water. On his way, a black cat darted from beneath one of our sheds and sprinted across his path, giving him a start, but he kept going. Once inside, he locked the door and headed down the hallway to the bedroom. He climbed into the top bunk and tried to relax. After a few minutes, he heard heavy, deliberate footsteps making their way toward him from the other end of the trailer. The footsteps paused outside his door. The handle didn't. move, but he said it felt as though something leaned into the doorway, watching him from just out of sight. Scared, he pulled the blanket over his head. After a minute, the presence left. Eventually, he dozed off. The next morning, he told us about it in hushed tones, though we tried to laugh it off. Things reached a new level not long after that. Some church friends dropped by for coffee and cake, bringing along a couple of teenage girls. They were bored after a while and suggested we play manhunt in the park under the moonlight. I didn't want to go at first, remembering the recent string of weirdness, but my protests didn't stop the older kids from dragging me along. We decided the woods would be out of bounds, a rule that made me breathe a little easier. The evening started off decently. A full moon lit the field, and we had a few flashlights if needed. We played a couple of rounds of manhunt, scurrying around under the starry sky, shining our flashlights at one another, tackling each other among the picnic tables. After a while, I started to let go of my anxiety and actually have fun. Then came the final round. I chose to hide under a picnic table facing the field and the treeline. Clouds drifted across the moon, and a faint mist was already seeping from the woods, drifting into the field. That was when I spotted a dark mass crouched on the jogging path right where it disappeared into a small cluster of pine trees. It looked more like a silhouette than a person, and it seemed to be roughly man-sized, though the hazy mist made it hard to judge. I was still trying to figure out if it was one of the older kids or maybe a teen from the new subdivision. Just then, a girl's scream rang out across the field. My brother and cousins came running to see if I was okay, but it turned out one of the girls had simply been tagged. The commotion broke my concentration. By the time I looked back, that shape stood up. In my shock or fear, it appeared nearly half as tall as the pine trees, so maybe around 7 feet tall, a looming figure that seemed far too large to be a normal person. As it turned away and slipped into the woods, my heart pounded so hard I could barely think. I told my siblings and cousins what I saw, but they shrugged it off, saying maybe it was just a taller kid. We decided to call the game and regroup. Everyone gathered by the chain-link fence surrounding the hockey rink, in a semicircle with our backs to the woods. My older cousins started recounting the odd experiences we'd had on our property, like the weird footsteps in the trailer and the black cat encounter. Then, right in the middle of his story, he froze, eyes wide. Without a word, he jumped up from the circle and bolted, fear written across his face. We spun around to see what had startled him, and that's when we saw it. A towering shadow figure, well over 6 feet, gliding through the mist just behind us. It had no distinct facial features, no color or detail at all. It was a black shape that radiated menace. That was enough for us. We collectively screamed and dashed into the safety of the hockey rink, forming a frantic circle with our backs together. The figure vanished into the haze, leaving us trembling in the flickering moonlight. One of the girls started sobbing while we all tried to catch our breath. After a few excruciating minutes, we realized we'd left our flashlights in the middle of the field. None of us dared retrieve them. Instead, we decided to make our way home. We locked arms in a sort of chain, each of us scanning in different directions, inching away from the rink. About halfway across the park, nerves got the better of one girl and she broke formation, sprinting down the dirt road. That set us all off, tearing after her, not stopping until we reached our front yard. Panting, we reported to our parents that some towering shadow had approached us in the park. The men, my dad, my uncle, and a friend, suspected it was a mischievous older teen or a prowler messing with us. They grabbed a few flashlights and headed to the park themselves. We waited, huddled in the living room, hearts still pounding. Eventually, they returned with confused expressions. They hadn't seen anybody. Worse, they'd found all 5 flashlights from the field, but each one was inexplicably dead, despite having fresh batteries earlier. That was enough to convince them something was off, though they still tried to reassure us we were probably letting our imaginations run wild. Yet the mismatch between fresh batteries and all flashlights drained was impossible to ignore. A few months later, my family moved to another city. Whatever we had witnessed, it didn't follow us. But the memory of that giant shadow man has stayed with me for over 2 decades, cropping up in occasional nightmares or stories I share around a campfire. I can't say for certain if it was the spirit of the old settler who had been murdered, Or maybe a Seminole warrior's restless ghost, or some entirely different phenomenon. All I know is that it wasn't a living, flesh and blood person. Its shape and size, plus the menacing aura that made the hair stand on my neck, was something far beyond a typical teenage prankster. Over the years, I've tried to rationalize it in a variety of ways, maybe group hysteria or an elaborate hoax. But the dread I felt, the sudden hush that fell whenever it appeared, and that creeping sense of being watched in the months leading up to it, all convinced me something more was at play. Sometimes, late at night, I recall the park's outlines in the moonlight, the swirling mist, and the faint shape of a figure that seemed half-blurred, half-real. It crosses my mind that we might have disturbed an ancient site or a spirit when the grave was found and desecrated. The unsettled land responded with sightings, strange animals, and eventually a dark presence that manifested in the park. After all these years, the event remains my most vivid brush with the unknown, a moment that set my pulse racing and forced me to reconsider how much we don't understand about the world around us. It was late December, and the night felt endless. Scott drove along a narrow country road, his headlights barely piercing the thick darkness. He leaned over the steering wheel, wondering if he would even see his own hand in front of his face if he stepped out there. A cold wind battered the edges of the truck windows, and the soft hum of the heater gave him a semblance of comfort. On the passenger seat lay an empty fast food bag and an old road map he didn't really need anymore, but kept for peace of mind. The radio station he'd been listening to all evening began to drift into static, overwhelmed by distance or lack of towers out here. The faint music turned into a distorted hiss, and the conversation of talk show hosts broke into fragments. Finally, Scott tapped the stereo's power button and let out a sigh. He couldn't rely on it to keep him company any longer. Now there was only the roar of his engine, the crunch of gravel under his tires, and his own thoughts. He was heading to his grandmother's house, a place nestled in a remote corner of Kentucky. The region was mostly farmland and winding roads, with occasional small towns scattered about. He hadn't been here in years and found himself lost in a sea of memories and questions, trying to recall whether to take this left or that right. The moon hid behind clouds, so the night felt particularly black. His mind started to wander. He thought about his family, about the old stories Granny used to tell him as a child, about the local folklore. He glanced at the clock on the dashboard. It was a little after 10. He told himself he'd be at Granny's by 10:30, maybe. That was if he didn't take a wrong turn or run into trouble. Just as he was drifting into deeper contemplation, he noticed something up ahead, a shape moving at the side of the road. Scott eased off the accelerator. His headlights caught a person walking. At first, it was just a silhouette, but as he drew closer, details emerged. The figure wore a helmet, maybe a hard hat. On his right shoulder rested a long tool, and he clutched a box with a handle in his left hand. The man's posture was hunched, trudging onward. Scott's brow furrowed. He had no idea there were mines out here, but it definitely looked like a coal miner. In these parts of Kentucky, it wasn't impossible. Still, how could someone see in such a pitch-black night? He started to weigh the pros and cons of pulling over. The man was surely exhausted, covered in coal dust, forced to walk who knows how far after a back-breaking shift. Scott pictured him trudging home in those worn boots. Another voice in Scott's head reminded him that picking up a stranger in the middle of nowhere might not be the safest idea, especially with the day's tension and the creeping sense of isolation. Yet Scott felt a pang of guilt at the thought of leaving the man to limp along the dark road. Then, from the depths of his conscience, one thought emerged. A working man walking along a lonely path at night, and me, too selfish to give him a ride? Resolute now, Scott slowed his truck to a stop, shifted into park, and quickly reached over to move his duffel bag from the passenger seat to the back. But in that short moment, when he glanced up again, the miner was gone. Vanished. 1 second, the man was lumbering along in the truck's beam. The next second, empty road. A jolt of fear spread through Scott's chest. He felt goosebumps erupt over his arms. With shaking hands, he put the truck back in drive and stomped on the accelerator, the tires kicking up a cloud of dusty gravel behind him. His heart thundered. He kept checking his rearview mirror, half convinced he'd see a figure sprinting after him. But there was nothing in the glare of the red taillights except swirling dust. He forced his eyes back on the road. The further he drove, the more he tried to calm himself. After maybe 2 miles, the adrenaline began to fade, and he started breathing more steadily. He found himself driving slower, his mind replaying that bizarre moment. Had he just hallucinated it? He clutched the steering wheel and forced his attention to the stretch ahead. Then a sign came into view. Scott recognized it as the Miners' Memorial sign. Next to it, a small path led to a structure and a statue. His headlights revealed the statue to be a coal miner with a pickaxe draped over his shoulder, in almost the exact pose as the figure Scott had spotted. That realization sent a wave of fresh fear through him, reminiscent of his father's old ghost stories. Scott felt his knuckles tighten on the wheel. He pushed the pedal and shot off onto a more familiar blacktop road that would lead him directly to Granny's. By the time he arrived, the house was aglow with Christmas lights, a festive break in the otherwise somber night. It was close to midnight when he settled into the spare bedroom, lit warmly by an old lamp, its shade printed with cheerful holiday patterns. But despite the comforting decorations, he couldn't sleep. He lay wide awake, staring at the ceiling, pondering the vanished miner. Eventually, he dozed off into a restless slumber, never quite forgetting the image of the man and his abrupt disappearance. At dawn, the urge to know more about last night's incident seized Scott's mind. After a quick breakfast, he told Granny he was going out for a drive. He couldn't bring himself to detail his exact motives, afraid she might brush it off or, worse, confirm that these roads held some sort of ghostly presence. So he climbed into his truck and retraced his route back toward the Miners' Memorial. This time, with daylight flooding the landscape, the place looked vastly different. In the golden morning sun, rolling hills of farmland stretched out, and the once foreboding road now seemed merely dusty and unremarkable. And yet, even in daylight, Scott felt a subtle heaviness. The environment seemed to carry a memory of the night's darkness. He slowed well before reaching the memorial, pulling off where a small gravel patch met the ditch. When he shut off the engine and got out, the morning air was crisp. Birds chirped in the distance, but there was an undercurrent of silence that didn't sit well with him. He walked a short way, scanning the area for any signs, footprints maybe, or an old path that the miner could have taken. The ground was scattered with leaves and bits of stone. A short distance ahead, he saw a house, an older structure with worn paint and a sagging porch. Nothing about it looked inviting, but it was the only dwelling in sight. Approaching it, Scott noticed some small holiday decorations, a wreath on the door, a string of faded lights around a window, enough to make him think maybe someone was home. He climbed the steps and rapped gently on the wooden door. He waited about a minute, ready to knock again, but then the door creaked open on its own, revealing a woman who looked as if she'd lived 100 lifetimes. She had a lined face and spoke with a thick accent, her voice raspy but calm. "I reckon I know why you're here," she said before stepping away, beckoning him inside without further explanation. Unsure, but strangely compelled, Scott mumbled thanks and followed her in, shutting the door behind him. The living room smelled of wood smoke and old, dusty antiques. Shelves displayed black and white photos of men in overalls, of children standing in front of barns, along with porcelain figurines that might have been decades old. A large deer head, complete with a wide span of antlers, was mounted above the fireplace. The old woman gestured to a worn leather couch. "Sit if you like," she offered. "Want anything to drink?" "Just some water, please," Scott replied, settling on the couch, feeling the creak of old springs beneath him. Nodding, she headed into the kitchen, leaving him a moment to observe. Framed pictures on the walls showed old mines, family gatherings, and what looked like a local baseball team in black and white. Then she returned, handing Scott a bottle of water. He thanked her. She took a seat across from him. "Let me guess," she said. "You saw something on the road last night." Her voice carried the weight of someone who'd heard this story a dozen times. Scott's pulse quickened. He recounted his run-in with the coal miner, the figure that vanished, and how spooked he'd been. She listened without reacting much, her expression calm, as though he were telling her the mildest piece of news. Eventually, he asked if she knew about any living coal miners in the area, or if there was a mine. She drew a long breath. 50 years ago, 38 men died in a coal mine explosion over yonder, she began. People say some of them never truly left. She then explained that there used to be a mine called Hurricane Creek, and on December 30th, 1970, a tragic explosion occurred hundreds of feet underground. My husband was one of them, she said quietly. I'm sorry, Scott said genuinely. She nodded, continuing with more details. The mine owners cut corners. The place wasn't up to code. Inspectors were bribed. Some men had even witnessed suspicious fuse lines. The explosion was no accident, at least not in the pure sense. A dark wave of wrongdoing had claimed dozens of lives. When she paused, Scott tried to process the idea that the figure he saw could be the spirit of a miner who died in that tragedy. She sighed, confessing that she'd once been skeptical too, but her own son encountered something similar on that very road when he was a teenager. She said her son recognized the figure as his father. Hearing that made a chill run down Scott's back. The old woman reached for a drawer in a nearby end table, pulling out a piece of paper. A handwritten account by her son's former girlfriend from decades ago. It described a night they'd driven out near the old mine site, singing along to Bruce Springsteen, only for the tape to distort, and a band of miner-like lights to appear, forming silhouettes around the truck. The father's face, so familiar to her boyfriend, had come into view for a moment, only to vanish when all the lights switched off. Their truck then restarted as if nothing had happened. Scott read it, feeling his heart thunder at each word. It perfectly echoed the sense of dread he'd felt, that moment of unstoppable fear when the figure simply vanished into the night. He handed the paper back, thanking the woman. She patted his hand, telling him her grief was long behind her, but these ghostly visitations were simply a legacy of the injustice done to the miners all those years ago. Eventually, Scott left, feeling both unsettled and oddly relieved that he wasn't alone in his experience. On his way out, she told him, "Be careful on that road after dark. If you see him again, try not to fear him too much. He might just be trying to find his way home." Scott drove back, the midday sun making the landscape seem friendly and safe. Yet the memory of that dark figure remained clear in his mind, as did the haunting words of the letter. Now he had some understanding. The spectral miner was likely connected to that 1970 explosion, wandering the roads near the memorial. The guilt or rage from such a tragic event might have anchored spirits to that place. He spent the afternoon at his grandmother's, quietly reflecting on what he'd learned. She asked him why he seemed pensive, but he kept the details to himself. That evening, the family gathered around a large dinner, passing turkey and stuffing, chatting about normal holiday things. Scott found it strange to talk about everyday topics after seeing something so extraordinary. Before bed, he slipped outside to look at the sky. The air was frigid, but still. He couldn't help but glance at the road behind the fence, imagining the figure trudging along with a pickaxe on his shoulder. The next morning, he considered driving that road again at night, just to see if the miner would appear. But a deep part of him warned that he'd been lucky once. Maybe it wasn't worth tempting fate. With a last glance at the line of trees far off, he decided that some mysteries were better left unsolved. The land held too many secrets, too much grief. Later that day, he started his journey back toward the city. The radio station worked fine once he was nearer to civilization. He hummed along to some music, eyes drifting to a sign that read, "Hurricane Creek Miners Memorial. Next right." He swallowed hard, recalling the letter describing how the beams of light circled that old truck. He had an urge to turn in, to see the memorial up close, but the recollection of the vanished miner on the road was still too fresh. Instead, he drove on, letting the sign pass in his peripheral vision. A minute later, he glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see a figure in the back seat. But there was nothing, just the reflection of bright Kentucky sunshine streaming through the window. Even months and years later, when the memory crosses his mind, sometimes prompted by a whiff of coal dust near a construction site, or the mention of an old mine accident on the news, Scott recalls the figure on that road. He recalls the old woman's unwavering expression, the handmade letter describing a ghostly scene from a decade prior. He thinks of the tragedy that claimed 38 lives, of corporate greed or negligence, and how such sorrow might imprint itself on a place, refusing to let go. It's a sadness that underscores the land's beauty with a quiet, persistent shadow. Scott doesn't share the story often. When he does, people usually give him a half smile, a polite nod, or some word of skepticism. That's okay because the experience wasn't for them, it was his to carry. He only hopes those miners found some measure of peace in the afterlife. And he drives more cautiously at night now, always aware that around any bend in a deserted road, a man in a dusty helmet might appear, carrying the burden of a past injustice, looking for a way home. I grew up in San Antonio, where local folklore runs deep, stories about the Alamo, the Menger Hotel, those legendary haunted train tracks, and one of the most famous among my friends, the Donkey Lady Bridge. Everyone around me had heard some version of these tales, each with its own dramatic twist or detail. The Donkey Lady Bridge legend was one of those that got under my skin the most, probably because of how gruesome it sounded. We were always told the bridge was haunted by a woman who had lived nearby many years back. According to the story, her family died in a fire set by her husband, either out of anger or madness. No one ever specified exactly why he did it. He and their children perished in the flames, but she survived, badly disfigured. The heat had supposedly melted her skin, fusing her fingers so that they resembled hooves, and her face elongated into something resembling a horse or a donkey. Some versions said she died right there, while others claimed she lived and prowled the area in anguish, screaming whenever she spotted anyone near the bridge. When you grow up hearing these sorts of stories, you mostly pass them off as eerie folklore, until you experience something you can't shrug off. After high school, I found myself in that familiar teenage space of seeking a good scare. My friends and I, thinking we were all edgy and brave, decided to head out to Donkey Lady Bridge one night. There's a ritual connected to it. You park your car on or near the bridge, turn the engine off, either flash your headlights 3 times or honk 3 times, then keep perfectly quiet. The rumor is that if you do that, you'll hear the Donkey Lady. If you're really unlucky, you might see her. We were more than curious enough to try. We got out there late one night. My friend, who I'll call Jay, was especially thrilled to prove how tough she was. The rest of us hovered between excited and terrified, though I tried to keep a confident front. The area around the bridge merges into Medina River Park, with some hiking trails that wind through a patch of woods. By day, it's a nice enough spot for a walk, but at night, it's pitch black, especially if the moon isn't bright. The roads out there are quiet, and the air always seems just a bit colder and heavier once you arrive. We parked on the bridge, turned off the car, and honked 3 times. Then we sat still, breath held, waiting. The first thing we heard sounded like hooves on pavement, kind of a gentle clip-clop, but it got louder as if it were approaching. Then came a scream, a distorted sound like a woman's voice mixed with an animal's braying. It wasn't a trick of the wind or a distant coyote. The effect was so disturbing that we all felt our hearts skip a beat. The noise cut off abruptly, leaving only the night's stillness. Nobody spoke at first. We were all absorbing it, adrenaline pumping in our veins. That's when Jay, to our complete dismay, decided she needed to look around. She was dead set on exploring, even though the rest of us were freaked out. But we couldn't just let her wander off on her own. If something was out there, it might not be safe. So, against our better judgment, we locked the car and followed her. The Donkey Lady Bridge stands near those hiking trails I mentioned, and we foolishly started strolling down one of them. Our phone flashlights weren't the best, but enough to see we were heading deeper into the trees. The further we walked, the thicker the undergrowth became, and the narrower the trail. The silence pressed down on us, as though the entire area was holding its breath. I've always had this feeling, a sort of sixth sense, for when things are about to go wrong, and it flared like a siren in my head. I felt as though we were being watched, a prickling of the skin at the back of my neck. The others must have felt it too, because we exchanged nervous looks and started whispering about heading back. Then, from the direction of the car, we heard the same noise again. Hooves on pavement, followed by that eerie scream. This time it was louder, more anguished, and it came from the very path we needed to take to return to the car. Right then, we also heard movement in the bushes to our side. Rustling leaves, something shifting around. Jay gasped and pointed, saying she saw eye shine in the undergrowth, two glowing spots moving toward us. That was enough to send us running. We took off in a sprint back down the trail. My lungs burned from the cold night air, and I'm asthmatic, so I couldn't keep up with everyone else. They powered ahead, not realizing I had to slow down. Before I knew it, they were far ahead, leaving me behind in near darkness. My heart hammered as I forced my legs to keep moving, the sound of those heavy hoofbeats echoing behind me. At one point, I thought I heard grunting or snarling, but it could have been my own breath rasping in my chest. I was convinced I'd be tackled at any moment by something large and monstrous. Fear kept me going, each step feeling like it would be my last if I stopped. I stumbled out of the trail into the open area near the bridge, breathless. My friends were gathered by the car, frantic. That's when we realized the engine wouldn't turn over. All of us were wound tight, glancing around, expecting something to leap out of the shadows. The screams and hooves were still echoing somewhere in the night, but this time they seemed to be circling us, coming closer. Jay fumbled with the keys, trying desperately to start the car. Meanwhile, we heard an awful scraping noise, like something heavy being dragged on the road surface, interlaced with another one of those chilling screams. All at once, something slammed against the passenger side of the vehicle, the side nearest the bridge. It rocked the car on its suspension. Whoever was on that side yelped, and we all started yelling over each other, fear rising like a tangible wave. The car was struck again, a fierce impact that rattled us. Someone cried out, demanding to know what was hitting us. Another was sobbing. I just crouched down in my seat, arms around my chest, adrenaline pounding in my veins. Then, as suddenly as it began, it stopped. Silence descended, heavy as a blanket. Jay tried the ignition again, and this time, miraculously, the car roared to life, headlights flashing on. We all breathed a collective sigh of relief briefly until we saw it. A figure standing dead ahead, almost like a translucent or misty shape, with glowing white eyes. There was just enough detail to see it was humanoid but distorted in a way that made me think of the legends, the donkey-like face, the elongated limbs. It stared at us, or so it seemed. Jay, shaking, managed to shift into drive. The headlights locked onto the figure, and in the next second, it charged forward, leaping onto the hood before vanishing as though it was never there. Our only thought was to get the hell out of there. The tires screeched, and we shot off down the road back into the city lights. We must have hit every bump and pothole, but no one cared. By the time we parked in front of my house, the entire car was silent. We sat catching our breath, each of us glancing at one another with wide eyes. No one could put into words what had just happened. Eventually, we all crashed at my place, hoping daylight might make sense of things. Morning came and we went out to inspect the car. There were no dents or scratches where we'd felt those hits, which baffled us. It looked physically undamaged. But bizarrely, there were hoof-like prints in the dust covering the exterior, as if some creature had clambered over the metal with 2 or 4 hooves. Each one was distinct enough that no one could write it off as a smudge or a handprint. After that, we tried returning to Donkey Lady Bridge a few times, but we never recreated that experience. We avoided honking or flashing the lights, never again wanting to provoke whatever roamed those woods. Sometimes we'd feel a sense of foreboding out there, a lingering heaviness, but we never saw or heard the Donkey Lady. Maybe we'd had our dose of the legend and she'd decided not to torment us further. Or maybe we just got lucky. To this day, I can't forget how her eyes glowed in those headlights, the frantic pounding on the car, and the petrifying screams. People ask me whether I believe in ghosts or demons or cryptids. Before that night, I would have shrugged and said I'm open to possibilities, but not convinced. Now, if anyone brings up the Donkey Lady Bridge, I feel a small knot of anxiety twisting in my stomach. I'll say something like, well, I've been there, and leave it at that. If they press for details, I'll recount the story, half laughing at how terrified we were, but underneath the laughter, I remember how real it all felt. I can't say definitively what we experienced that night, whether it was truly the spirit of that disfigured woman from the local legend or some other force playing with our senses. But the marks on the car and the fear I felt were very real. It taught me that sometimes old stories, legends we hear growing up, might hold a kernel of truth. Maybe the donkey lady never existed, or maybe she did in some tragic form. But whatever lurks around that bridge, it made its presence known to us. I haven't gone back since, and I don't think I ever will. There are enough mysteries in the world. I don't need to repeat the one that left me breathless and trembling on a remote Texas road under the moonlight. I remember it was a late evening when my two close friends, whom I'll call A and K, came over to my house for one of our regular sleepovers. We were all in our later teenage years, old enough to drive but still living under our parents' roofs. We'd had plenty of nights like this before, staying up, watching horror movies, talking about people we knew, and sometimes dabbling with more unusual activities like trying to make our own Ouija board. We were a curious trio, fascinated by the idea that perhaps there was another realm out there beyond our immediate, everyday reality. While we understood that Ouija boards weren't toys and that they came with real risks, the three of us still couldn't help but be drawn in by the possibility of communicating with spirits. We had dabbled in seances a couple of times prior, always following certain precautions. We'd say prayers, light candles, burn incense, and arm ourselves with objects we believed could offer protection. We had crystals, little pieces of silver, and other trinkets that each of us felt would help ward off anything malicious. Despite our awareness of the dangers, it was thrilling to think we might speak to an entity who'd share secrets from beyond. That night, we prepared our homemade Ouija board once again. It was a makeshift thing we'd crafted from a sturdy piece of wood, carefully marking it with letters, numbers, and words like yes, no, and goodbye. We even had a planchette that we'd carved from some scrap material. Before sitting down to begin, we made sure to set the mood, dimming the lights in my living room, letting the gentle glow of candles create dancing shadows on the walls. The smell of incense wafted around us, sweet and heady, making the air feel almost charged with potential. There was an electric hush as we sat cross-legged around the board. Outside, the sky was dark, the only sounds coming from the occasional car passing down the street or the hush of a fan inside the house. We placed our fingertips on the planchette, closed our eyes, and recited a short prayer, asking for protection and clarity. We were used to addressing the spirits politely, never demanding. We'd heard enough stories about how being disrespectful could open doors we didn't want to open. Gradually, the planchette began to move beneath our fingertips. I felt my pulse quicken, that familiar mix of excitement and apprehension settling into my stomach. Kay, who tended to be the most open and sensitive to these experiences, was already softly whispering that something was trying to come through. We asked if there was a spirit who wished to talk with us. Slowly, the planchette spelled out a name, Warren. We recognized this name right away. It belonged to a spirit we'd encountered in previous sessions. Warren had come across as a gentle presence, an entity that didn't seem malevolent. In our earlier communications, he had claimed to be extremely old, so old that he couldn't recall precisely when he died. We didn't know if that was entirely accurate, but we had no reason to disbelieve him. Each time we spoke with Warren, the conversation was calm, lacking the sinister undertones people often associate with Ouija boards. The planchette would move slowly, as though Warren's energy was faint. That night, though, Warren's presence felt weaker than usual. Maybe it was because we were tired or because the energy in the room wasn't stable. The board gave half answers and sluggishly spelled out words, leaving us uncertain how to proceed. Then the planchette began catching on the board in an odd way, as if something physically stuck beneath it. We decided to pause the seance, say goodbye to Warren politely, and try to fix the planchette. We carefully inspected the underside, smoothing away any rough edges or chips of wood that might be causing friction. All the while, we chatted about random things. School, rumors we'd heard, who was dating who. But partway through the conversation, Kay and I got into a minor spat. It was a silly argument, one that escalated out of nowhere. I sat quietly, watching us bicker, looking increasingly uncomfortable. Eventually, we resolved the tension. I apologized, Kay apologized, and we agreed to drop it. That was when I finally spoke up. She said something like, "Hey, do you guys feel like we're not alone anymore?" Her tone was hushed, almost reverent. At first, I was confused by her question. Then I realized there was a thickness in the air, a heaviness I hadn't noticed earlier. It felt as though someone else was in the room with us, someone we hadn't invited. The three of us locked eyes, recognizing the shift in the room's energy. The candles flickered ominously, though there wasn't any draft. We decided to place the board back in front of us. Kay lit another stick of incense, a pungent, herbal fragrance that was supposed to purify the space. I clutched a small amethyst crystal in one hand, and I took a deep breath to steady my nerves. Slowly, we put our hands on the planchette again. "Warren," I ventured, feeling uncertain. "Warren, can we speak with you?" Usually, it took a few moments for the planchette to respond, a slow, deliberate movement. This time, the response came instantly, sliding to an O. The abruptness of it made my skin prickle. We'd never gotten such a swift answer before. My mind raced with possibilities. Maybe Warren was too tired or simply unavailable. But still, I found that NO unsettling, especially as a first message. Trying to stay calm, I asked, "Who is this?" The planchette spelled out, Saturn. We exchanged glances. That was definitely not a name we recognized. Kay began to question Saturn. She wanted to know basic things like if Saturn had been around for a while or how Saturn died. Saturn claimed to have died within the last decade, which contrasted with Warren's admission of being ancient. Saturn also explained she was a cancer patient who passed away after undergoing chemotherapy. On the surface, none of that sounded particularly sinister, just a modern tragedy. But as the conversation wore on, Saturn's answers felt charged. There was tension in the atmosphere, that same heaviness from before, only intensifying. We ran out of substantial questions. Perhaps, in hindsight, we should have considered letting Saturn go, but we were still too curious. Kay asked something lighthearted, hoping to shift the mood. "What's your favorite color?" The planchette jerked into motion, spelling out, CROAK. We froze, exchanging puzzled looks. "Croak," I repeated. "What does that mean?" The planchette moved again, CROAK, a second time. My heart started beating faster, and I noticed Kay's hand trembling. She had a worried expression, tears forming in her eyes. "Why are you spelling that?" I whispered, but before I could pose another question, the board spelled croak for a third time, each letter coming faster than the one before. It was as if Saturn was hammering it in. Kay let out a sob, pulling her hands away. "Stop!" she cried. "I feel sick. Please, let's say goodbye." She was shaking, tears streaming down her cheeks. We didn't hesitate. A and I quickly guided the planchette to goodbye, then removed our fingers. For a moment, I half expected some pushback from the board, but nothing happened. We put it away, blowing out the candles and opening a window to let in fresh air. The tension drained slightly from the room. I turned my attention to Kay, who was by then hyperventilating. She explained that the moment the board spelled croak, she felt a wave of nausea. Each repetition of the word heightened that physical sense, as though something was pressing on her stomach and chest. I tried to comfort her with a glass of water and some deep breathing exercises. After a few minutes, she calmed down. The rest of the night was eerily uneventful. We stuck to mundane distractions, watched a comedy movie, raided the fridge for leftovers, and eventually dozed off. The next morning, the first rays of daylight made us feel safer. We talked about what had happened, tossing around theories. Maybe Saturn had found our question trivial or disrespectful. Or maybe the negativity from Kay's and my argument had attracted a more hostile spirit that latched onto us. I never had the sense we were dealing with Warren at all, as if Saturn had muscled her way into our session, drawn by the negative energy in the air. Weeks passed, and we didn't revisit the seance. Ouija boards lost some of their allure for me personally. The thought of encountering that sort of hostility again wasn't appealing. Yet I didn't entirely give them up. In subsequent months, I used the board a few times by myself or with other friends, always taking precautions. I made sure no one argued beforehand, that we set a peaceful tone. None of those later attempts came close to replicating the unsettling edge that Saturn brought into the room. At some point, A told me in confidence that she'd started having recurring nightmares. In them, she saw her hair falling out in clumps, leaving her scalp raw. She connected it to Saturn's claim of dying after chemotherapy. It was as though Saturn was showing what she had experienced. Or maybe a subconscious latched onto Saturn's story and manifested it in dream form. Either way, it bothered her deeply for some time. She refused to try another session for nearly a year after that. Over the years, we've all grown up and gone our separate ways, but we still recall that night. Kay rarely talks about it, although she remains convinced that the spirit we contacted wasn't Saturn at all. She speculates that some darker entity simply used Saturn's name as a mask. A is a bit more measured, acknowledging that we can't be sure if it was truly malevolent or simply lost and anguished. But me, I tend to believe that we angered or intrigued something by letting negative energy fill the room. The old caution about Ouija boards is that conflict, fear, or bitterness can make you vulnerable, attracting the energies that feed off negative emotions. Regardless of the exact cause, I have no desire to speak with Saturn again. Of all the spiritual sessions we did, that night remains the most disturbing, both in the abrupt shift of mood and the lingering effect it had on my friends. If anyone asks me for advice on Ouija boards, I tell them to be cautious with their emotional state before they begin. Don't do it if you're upset, drunk, or harboring conflict in your group. Such negativity can open a door you don't want opened. And if they press further, I share the story of Saturn and the word croak repeated again and again, how it rattled even my bravest friend and left her trembling with tears. Perhaps that word was a reference to the final moments of Saturn's suffering, a symbol of her anguish. Or maybe it was a threat, some twisted expression of the spirit's frustration. We'll never know for certain. I do know that after that night, our friendship changed slightly. We were still close, but a subtle line was drawn, reminding us that we didn't fully understand what lurked in the spaces we tried to contact. Something had stared back at us, and it was neither patient nor polite. We are only visitors in the realm beyond, and not every spirit we meet there is eager to chat or share a gentle, harmless presence. Even now, I still have the old board, tucked away in a closet. Sometimes I consider throwing it out, but I never do. Part of me sees it as a reminder that I can't just dismiss the unknown, that there are forces or energies that respond in ways we can't predict. Another part of me is simply attached to the memories, good or bad, of late-night sessions with friends in my childhood bedroom. But I also know that the next time I even think about pulling it out, I'll remember Saturn's presence and Kay's sobbing. That alone makes me hesitate, a caution that runs deeper than any curiosity. I was 11, that in-between age where grown-ups don't let you walk a mile on your own, yet you can spend an entire day babysitting your little brother without anyone thinking twice about it. In my case, that's exactly how it was. My mother was on her own, raising me and my 2-year-old brother, Tommy. We lived in a small, worn-down house near the edge of a small town. My father had never been in the picture. Mom didn't know which of the local junkies he was, and he hadn't paid a dime in child support, ever. Mom got by on meager paychecks, hustling through various odd jobs until she finally landed a more regular position as a nurse's aide at the local nursing home. She left early every morning, so I was in charge of Tommy, doing what needed doing around the house. Cooking a little, watching TV with him, cleaning up if we made messes. None of us were thrilled with the arrangement, but it was how we survived. Before she got that job, our mornings were slower and a lot more cheerful. She had time to take us to the park by the riverfront, a place I loved because I could run around or imagine wild adventures. But since she started her new job, those trips stopped. She was gone too early to bring us anywhere, and by the time she came home, she was too tired to bother. It didn't help that the weather always seemed wrong on her days off. Gray clouds, drizzling rain, or a real downpour that turned the park's flood zone into a soggy mess. I asked her if I could go by myself, maybe take Tommy along, but she refused. She insisted it wasn't safe, that it was too far for a girl my age. I whined, but it did no good. She was set in her ways. I started to fantasize about sneaking off to the park when she was at work. The idea took shape slowly. At first, I dismissed it as impossible. Who would watch Tommy? Then a half-formed plan emerged. Maybe I'd leave him sleeping, go quickly, and be back before he stirred. Guilt twitched in my mind, because if he woke up and needed something, food, a new diaper, he'd be all alone. But the dream of returning to the park was so strong, so reminiscent of simpler times. So I told myself I'd do it quickly, no more than 30 or 40 minutes away, just enough time to breathe that river air and stretch my legs on the swings. One night, I set my alarm clock for 20 minutes after my mother left in the morning. She typically locked the house behind her, but I had a plan for that too. I carefully laid out clothes, a jacket, my old sneakers, plus a hat and sunglasses. I had this notion that if anyone we knew passed by in their car, they wouldn't recognize me from a distance if I wore a disguise. I felt almost silly, but I was determined. Right before bed, I crept around, making sure I could slip out unnoticed. That morning, the alarm went off as planned. I got up softly, checking that Tommy was still asleep in his toddler bed. My heart pounded with excitement and guilt as I tiptoed across the worn linoleum floor. I put a couple of pillows under my blanket to mimic my shape in case Mom came back. I told myself she never did, but anxiety gnawed at me anyway. Next, I grabbed a bottle of water and a pack of Pop-Tarts from the cupboard, figuring I might get hungry. Then, carefully, I flipped the deadbolt, turned the knob, and slipped onto the porch. A rush of cool morning air hit my face. The sky was still a pale gray, dawn not fully broken. My mother's car was long gone, so no one was around to see me. I felt a rush of freedom, tempered by that tingle of fear at doing something I wasn't supposed to. It was about a mile to the park, a straight shot along a rough sidewalk that paralleled the main road. The houses along the way varied from small, well-kept places to a few that looked abandoned, with chipped paint and boarded-up windows. Initially, my mind buzzed with the thrill of my disobedience. I pictured the park's tall swings, the worn-down slides, the big oak tree by the river's edge. But half a mile in, I noticed the wind shifting and dark clouds rolling in. The drizzle started as a light patter, soon building into a cold rain. The asphalt glistened beneath my sneakers, and puddles began forming in the dips of the sidewalk. A chill sank into me. My jacket could only handle so much water. I unwrapped my Pop-Tarts and munched on them, hoping to keep my spirits up. The distance didn't bother me, but the rising rain did, especially since I worried about how I'd explain coming home soaked to the bone. Reluctantly, I paused. The park was still some distance away. The water droplets were turning heavier, tapping on my hat. A small voice in my head said, "Turn back. You can try another day." So I did. I spun around and started walking home. The rain kept coming, heavier and heavier, and by the time I got back to our small yard, I was shivering. Our porch squeaked under my feet, and I reached for the knob. That's when I realized my mistake. I had only unlocked the deadbolt, not the doorknob. In my excitement, I'd never turned the little knob lock. So the door was still locked. Part of me wanted to knock, but that would be pointless. My mother was gone, and Tommy was too young to open the door. I tried to peer through the window, but it was shut tight, and Mom always insisted on locking them. I stood there in the rain, cursing my foolishness. The rational side said, "Wait here until your mother returns." But she wouldn't be back until late afternoon, and I knew Tommy would eventually wake up crying for breakfast. Guilt squirmed in my stomach. I was stuck outside with no quick fix. I debated whether to check neighbors, but the nearest neighbor was a good half-mile away. Instead, in a moment of frustration, I decided I might as well finish what I started. The park was the only place I wanted to be, so I marched off again. By the time I reached the park, the sky was a grim, moody gray. Water dripped from my hat and chin, but there it was, the row of swings, the old seesaw, the battered slide set, and beyond them, the wide, swirling river. Thanks to the rain, it was already cresting higher than usual. I felt a jolt of thrill as I realized I had the entire place to myself. It was deserted, probably because all the other kids were either still in bed or in school, or sensible enough not to come out in the pouring rain. For a moment, I savored the feeling of standing alone in my own private wonderland. The soaked clothes clung to my body, giving me a bizarre sense of weightlessness. My imagination kicked in. Suddenly, a random stick on the ground became a cutlass, and I was a swashbuckling pirate. The playground equipment transformed into a series of ships battling on high seas. Each tower or platform was a deck I had to storm. Each wooden beam or metal bar was a rigging to climb. The pouring rain became the ocean spray. I felt giddy, almost forgetting my brother, my locked house, and the cold. I hopped from ship to ship, shouting commands at imaginary crew members, brandishing my stick sword. The swirling river in the distance hammered home the illusion that a raging sea was just beyond the planks. Emboldened by the fantasy, I declared a final showdown with some imaginary captain. In my mind, he wore a black coat and brandished a curved blade, so I swung my stick valiantly. I hopped onto the tallest platform, the SS Gladiator, plunging my sword into the floor. Then I slid down the biggest slide, imagining I was diving off the ship into the ocean below. That's when a real sound startled me. A loud splash, followed by 3 smaller splashes, echoing beneath the slide. My daydream broke. I realized I was just an 11-year-old boy, drenched on a playground. Confused, I looked around, seeing no one. My heartbeat quickened. Did I imagine those splashes? Or was someone else here? I stepped cautiously around the edge of the slide, leaning down to peer beneath its metal frame. The wood chips were soaked and mashed, but nothing else was visible. My fear spiked, though. Maybe the water had lapped up from the rising river? Or a stray dog had run by. I tried to calm myself, reminding myself I was alone. Nonetheless, my heart pounded fiercely. Part of me wanted to flee, but the lingering desire to enjoy the rain before heading home made me stay. I told myself it was just an echo or my imagination. So I found a new vantage point to continue my game. I scaled the side of another piece of playground equipment, gripping my stick as though it was a grappling hook. I felt a flutter of excitement, half lost in fantasy again. Then, as I pulled myself over the edge, I saw him. A boy perched on top of the platform, as still as a statue. He wore tattered clothes that clung to him in the rain. His skin an unnerving greenish-black, veins showing darkly. His lips were bluish, parted slightly. Worst of all, he held a stick exactly like mine, as though mirroring me. I froze in shock, staring into his eyes, except I couldn't make out the color of his eyes, just dark hollows that seemed to swallow the rainy light. Time lurched. A silent scream formed in my throat, then burst out as a panicked cry. Fear hammered my body, and I jerked back, stumbling off the platform. I fell into the sodden wood chips, twisting away from the figure. Without looking back, I scrambled to my feet and sprinted away, the muddy water splashing around my ankles. My jacket flapped with each step, and the rain pelted me as I rushed toward the nearest sidewalk. When I finally dared to glance over my shoulder from the edge of the park, I saw him. He was still standing there, up on that platform, and he raised one arm as though waving. The sight nearly made me double over with terror. I turned again, pushing my legs to run faster than I thought possible. Eventually, I made it back to the road. My chest burned, my breath ragged. The rain hammered on, and I felt exhaustion creeping in. But fear kept me moving, spurring me all the way home, my mind spinning with what I'd seen. By the time I reached our house, I was trembling, soaked to the bone, hugging myself for warmth. Tommy's cries echoed through the walls. He'd woken up alone, hungry or scared. My mother wasn't home yet, of course. I didn't want to break a window or do something that'd tip her off. So I huddled on the porch, tears mixing with the rain, until at last, in the late afternoon, she drove up. The moment she got out of the car, she saw me, drenched and pale with fright. She rushed over, frantically asking what happened. I babbled about the door being locked, about going to the park in secret. Furious, she gave me the scolding of a lifetime right there on the porch. A few swats to my backside that stung more from my raw nerves than actual pain. But when she asked me to explain more, to tell her why I was so scared, I haltingly described the boy in the park. I half expected her to think I was lying. Instead, her face changed. She seemed unsettled. Then, quietly, she told me a story. Years ago, a child from town drowned at the riverfront park during a flood. He was about my age and never made it out of the water. She had gone to school with him. They'd been in the same grade. Her words sank in, making me shiver anew. It was as though I'd glimpsed the wandering spirit of that lost boy, still clinging to the place where he'd died. My mother let me inside, told me to go and change out of my wet clothes. Then we tended to Tommy. She never grounded me for that day. She must have sensed that I'd been punished enough by the fright. Or maybe she was too rattled herself, recalling the old tragedy. Though I'm older now, a lot older than I was, I still think about that boy's face whenever the sky grows dark with rain and I'm near a park or a body of water. I wonder if I truly encountered his spirit, or if stress and guilt conjured up something in my mind. But I can't shake the memory of that greenish-black skin, the parted lips, and how he raised his hand in a silent, almost lonely gesture. If it was a ghost, perhaps he just wanted someone to notice him, to remember. Or maybe he was just as startled by me as I was by him. Either way, I've never gone back to that park alone. I learned that some fantasies, while they might make for a thrilling daydream, can lead you to corners of reality you're not prepared to handle. And I guess that's how I'll always remember that day, as a moment when childhood bravado met something far beyond my understanding. I was a sophomore at Central High, a school notorious for its imposing architecture and the swirling rumors that it was haunted. The building was a patchwork of eras. The original brick structure with the distinctive tower in the center, flanked by modern wings added across the decades. People told tales about steam tunnels linking the older parts of the school, of certain corners supposedly haunted by ghostly apparitions, of old legends that a violent principal once tortured difficult students in hidden rooms. You know how every school has stories like that. But at Central, the stories felt different. More raw, more insistent. I'd grown up hearing about them, and so had my friends. By the time we were well into the semester, my group of friends and I decided to explore the truth behind the legends. Classes at Central started early and ended late, but the building never felt truly empty until well after the final bell rang. We wanted to be in the school at night, after the lights were off with no teachers around. Let the building reveal its secrets. But sneaking in after hours was no small feat. The campus security patrolled. The doors were locked, and any suspicious presence would bring down staff or even the police. We needed a solid plan. The one who hatched the idea was Paul. He suggested we join the drama department. Their big musical that season was South Pacific, and the drama teacher needed stagehands, set movers, lighting assistants, and so on. Volunteers were often welcome. No audition needed if you were just behind the scenes. Paul argued that if we were on the backstage crew, we could remain in the building as late as we wanted without drawing attention. Once the final rehearsal ended or the performance concluded, the drama teacher would lock up, but as long as we stayed behind to clean, we could slip deeper into the empty halls, never actually leaving. We jumped on the plan. Among the 6 of us, 2 actually joined drama crew, Rich and me. The others, Sarah, Michelle, Dan, and Tim, would wait for us to let them in. We'd basically stage a reason for them to come help us move some leftover props or something, well after the teacher had gone. The performances ended around 9 or 10 in the evening, and by midnight, the entire school would be silent. Perfect. So South Pacific ran 3 nights. We chose Saturday, the final evening, which guaranteed no one would show up the next day for a random Sunday check. All our parents thought we were busy with stage duties, so no one expected us home until midnight or so. The show concluded, the audience departed, the cast changed out of costumes and took their leave. The drama teacher gave us cursory instructions to gather loose props, put away leftover paint, and vacuum the stage. Then she left, ensuring the front doors were locked behind her. We were now in the building alone. As planned, I slipped down the main corridor, unbolted a back exit, and let the others in. We huddled by a darkened vending machine, armed with a couple of cheap flashlights and the naive courage typical of teenagers. Tim was the only one who carried an actual flashlight from home. The rest of us had half-charged phones. The ancient hallways were lit only by emergency exit signs and faint security lights spaced far apart. The vast emptiness of it all gave me chills. We split into 3 pairs. Me with Sarah, Rich with Paul, and Michelle with Dan. The logic was that no one should be alone. We planned to roam, see if we could find the tunnels or any hot spots rumored to be haunted. The old gym, the older science wing, the original tower at the building center. We agreed to meet up in the new gym after about an hour. Sarah and I took the second-floor corridor leading past the principal's office and history classrooms. Our footsteps echoed on the polished tile. At one point, we passed a row of old black and white photos of past principals. Stoic men, old-fashioned haircuts, stiff suits. The rumored deadly principal was presumably from an era too old for photos, or maybe the school had removed him from the records. We teased each other about seeing his ghost in the empty offices, hearing a whip crack. But as we moved along, we heard nothing except the occasional hum of the air conditioning. Sarah and I began to suspect these stories might just be myths. We opened a few classroom doors, shining our lights around. Desks, chairs, silent blackboards, nothing weird. We checked the older science lab with its battered counters and skeleton model in the corner. The skeleton was plastic, of course, but I gave it a playful rattle, expecting a jump scare, yet nothing came. Time seemed to drag, so after about half an hour, we started heading to the new gym, ready to see if the others had anything interesting to report. They were already there when we arrived. Dan pacing near the bleachers, Michelle leaning against the wall, looking bored. Rich and Paul strolled in from another side door soon after. We gathered near the free throw line, sitting on the polished wood floor, comparing notes. Every single one of us reported no sightings, no footsteps, no lights flickering, absolutely nothing. We had begun to laugh at ourselves, mocking how gullible we'd been, telling each other we might as well bail out and get a midnight snack. That's when a chair shot across the gym from the far side and slammed into the wall. We froze, hearts pounding. The metallic clang echoed. No one else was near the stands or behind them. The place was wide open, with bright lines marking the basketball court. The jarring noise snapped us from joking to full alert. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw motion on the floor, hundreds of scattering dots. Flashlights turned, revealing a mass of cockroaches rushing across the polished wood. Most of us had occasionally seen a random roach in the school halls, but never this many. It was a swarming, skittering wave. "Let's get out of here," Michelle shouted, her voice trembling. We dashed to the double doors leading out of the gym. The moment we burst into the corridor, my mind reeled with confusion. Roaches are not typical in such quantity. It felt unnatural, like something had unleashed them. The building seemed to hum with tension. We decided to climb a stairwell, though in hindsight, going up might not have been smart. But we wanted distance from those roaches. Eventually, we found ourselves on the second floor. The corridor was dimly lit by a single overhead light, its dull glow reflecting off the tile. We paused to catch our breath, leaning against the wall outside a classroom. That's when we heard heavy footsteps down the hall. No teacher, no janitor should be around at this time, so who was it? It sounded deliberate, each step echoing. We pressed our backs to the wall, hoping to let whoever it was walk past. The plodding grew louder, more resonant. A wave of dread settled over us. "Oh, fuck this," Rich muttered, and he and Paul scurried into the nearest classroom, Sarah right behind them. The door slammed shut behind them. The footsteps abruptly stopped, as though responding to the sound of the door. For a few seconds, we heard nothing. Then, screams exploded from behind the door. Rich's, Paul's, Sarah's voices all overlapping in terrified cries. Something banged against the walls, loud and repetitive. Dan lunged for the doorknob, twisting, but it felt stuck. The shrieks continued, along with heavy thuds that rattled the door. Fear hammered in my chest. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the knob gave way. We yanked it open. Inside, the scene was chaos. Desks and chairs lay overturned, some jammed against the walls with enough force that I couldn't imagine how they got there. Sarah was crouched in a corner, her face streaked with tears, whimpering, a puddle of urine by her feet. Paul and Rich hovered near the window, but Rich staggered toward it as though wanting to throw himself out. "Get him!" I shouted at Dan, and Dan grabbed Rich's arms. Rich struggled, eyes wide and frantic. "Let me go!" he shrieked. "I have to jump. Let me die." The rest of us pulled together. "We're leaving," I yelled, trying to maintain a calm tone. "We're done here." Michelle helped Sarah stand. The poor girl could hardly walk, still trembling. We half-dragged her. Dan wrestled with Rich, who was raving about darkness, about seeing something horrendous. We ushered them out into the hall, hearts racing, expecting more footsteps or roaches. The instant we emerged, every classroom door along the hallway slammed shut in unison. Bang, bang, bang. Then, as if a monstrous force toyed with us, they all swung open again and slammed once more. The repeated clatter was deafening. Sarah buried her face in Michelle's shoulder, moaning in terror. Dan cursed, pulling Rich along with him, and Paul sputtered, "I can't do this anymore." So we fled down the stairs. The roaches we'd left behind in the gym had scattered. Our only thought was to find the nearest exit door. We found one, a big steel door with a crash bar. Pushing on it, the door refused to budge at first, like the building itself wanted to trap us. "Push harder," Michelle shouted, and together we slammed into it. Eventually, it gave way, letting in the cold night air. We stumbled out into the parking lot, our breath clouding in the chilly air. The door swung shut behind us with a final clang. We didn't bother to see if it locked. We just wanted to get away. In the lot, we had come in separate cars. Michelle and Paul hoisted Sarah into one vehicle. Dan assisted Rich into another. I dashed to my own car. My hands shook as I fumbled for the keys, glancing back at the silhouette of Central High. A single light glowed in the tower. I froze. Something stood at that window, a figure unmistakably human, or so it seemed. It stared down at us from the gloom, unmoving. My chest tightened with the realization. The building's old legends might be truer than we ever believed. That Sunday, none of us could bear to return to the school. We spent the day messaging each other, half in denial, half in shock. But come Monday morning, class was mandatory. We had to walk the same halls in daylight, greet teachers, pretend nothing unusual had happened. Yet deep down, we all knew something roamed those corridors at night. Something that could fling chairs, summon roaches, manipulate doors, drive people to the brink of madness. The next day, I heard a rumor that the janitor found a scattering of desks and chairs in disarray near the second-floor classroom, and nobody knew how it happened. He chalked it up to teenage pranksters. We said nothing. Ever since then, I've carried the knowledge that the ghost stories about Central High might not be just stories. It's one thing to laugh at legends about a sadistic principal from an era long gone, or to talk about steam tunnels rumored to be haunted by hangings. It's another to see with your own eyes how the building can come alive with malevolence. The memory of how that figure must have watched us leave from the top tower window still sends chills through me. We'd awakened something, or it found us, and it let us know that these old, familiar halls could turn hostile in a heartbeat. In the weeks that followed, we tried to focus on finishing the school year, ignoring the creeping sense that somewhere behind the fresh paint and modern expansions lurked the ancient structure that had seen countless generations of students, teachers, administrators, and possibly darker fates. We still had to go to English, math, history, and so on. We passed each other in the halls, sometimes exchanging quick glances of unease. Sarah refused to talk about that night, her eyes often downcast. Rich avoided the second floor entirely, taking a longer route to classes if it meant staying away from that corridor. Dan, Michelle, and Paul stuck close together, never letting each other roam alone after practice or clubs. I suspect the teachers thought we were simply bonding as a group of friends, but we knew better. By the end of the semester, we parted ways for summer. Some were moving, some had jobs lined up, but that night remained burned into our memories. We never staged another infiltration at Central, never tried to test the supernatural waters again. The building's expansions might continue, new wings might open, but the original structure's secrets remain. Sometimes, hearing a rumor about the school conjures that image of a solitary figure in the tower, watching, maybe waiting for the next foolish group of teenagers to challenge the ghosts of Central High. When I was 18, I often found myself bored to tears. So one late night I ended up hanging out with my friend, whom I'll call James, and his cousin, whom I'll call Eric. We were restless, itching for something to do beyond the usual watching TV or scrolling through our phones. Eventually, one of us said, "Hey, let's do something stupid. Let's go somewhere creepy." And so we fell into that teenage mindset. Find a haunted place and see if we could scare ourselves silly. We started looking up supposedly haunted spots nearby. In our area, the top result that popped up was this place known informally as the Scary Dairy. It sat on old land that had once been part of a state hospital farm, connected to a university that stood not too far away. We had heard plenty of rumors about it. People talked about overgrown buildings, gutted barns, strange rituals in the fields. Everyone said it was definitely haunted, though that kind of statement gets thrown around a lot. Still, we were bored, so we thought, why not see for ourselves? The property had two main areas that people generally visited. The old dairy farm remnants, which included a dilapidated barn or two, and the last surviving structure of the actual asylum portion. For that night, we decided to park near the main hiking trail that led to the ruined dairy barn. The trail was public during the day. Folks would walk their dogs, ride horses, or just stroll in the California sunshine. But at night, it was a different scene entirely. It was Southern California, so even late at night in the so-called winter, the temperature might hover in the mid-70s. The darkness, however, gave the place a drastically different ambience. The trail was narrow, maybe wide enough for 3 people side by side, and it traced the gentle hills leading up toward the campus. Since it was known to be home to coyotes, mountain lions, deer, and even rattlesnakes, we decided to bring a few knives just in case. One of us had a small pocket knife, another had a different blade, and Eric carried an absurdly large 17-inch Bowie knife that he insisted we'd never actually need. It seemed better safe than sorry, or so we told ourselves. It was around midnight when we got out of James's car, stepping onto the dark trail. The sky was nearly moonless, but we had flashlights. We quickly realized how black everything was beyond the beam of our lights. For the first few minutes, nothing felt unusual. We laughed about scaring each other, joked about seeing ghosts, and simply tried not to trip on the uneven ground. The only real sounds were crickets and the faint rustle of whatever small animals scurried among the brush. About 20 minutes in, we hit that typical lull where you start thinking, maybe there's nothing creepy at all. We passed a large tree next to a fenced-off area which contained a metal barn frame, like those you see in farmland scenes from the movies. We decided to stop for a breather, letting the hush settle around us. That was when things changed. I remember we switched off our flashlights for a moment. Sometimes, letting your eyes adjust can be cool, letting the starlight help us see. But no sooner did we do that than everything around us seemed to go dead silent. I heard my breath catch in my throat. Usually, nighttime is loud with insects and small creatures, especially in the brush. But the abrupt quiet was unnerving, as if nature itself had paused. From the corner of my eye, I caught a flicker of movement. It was fast, so fast that I doubted my own eyes. But I turned my head to stare, and James, standing next to me, broke the silence by asking, "Did you see that?" I nodded, realizing my heart was pounding. Eric was transfixed, staring directly into the barn's interior. With no roof or walls, just a metal skeleton. The interior was an open space of shadow. I aimed my flashlight into it. That's when we spotted them. Tall, shadowy figures darting from one side of the barn to the other. They moved at improbable speed, all in complete silence. At first, I thought it had to be pranksters wearing dark clothes. But then I remembered the fence. There was chain link all around that structure, no obvious entrance. If it were people, how were they running so quickly across enclosed space, never hitting the fence? And they moved in that weird, glitchy manner you sometimes see in horror movies, like frame skipping. It was deeply unsettling. While we were still trying to process this, James tapped me on the shoulder, hissing in a trembling voice, "Hey man, point your light up the trail." So I swung my flashlight around, scanning the path. About 20 feet ahead, The beam landed on a tall silhouette shaped like a person but stretching a good foot or two taller than me, and I'm nearly 6 feet. This figure was so dark it seemed to absorb the light, not reflecting anything. I couldn't see clothes or details, just a humanoid shape. That was all it took for Eric to bolt, spinning around and sprinting back in the direction of the car. James and I exchanged a wide-eyed look, then followed, fear fueling our legs. And so began a chaotic retreat. The trail was maybe half a mile to the parking area, but that felt like a marathon in the dark. We tried to keep our flashlights steady so we wouldn't trip, though fear made our steps clumsy. I glanced to the side at one point, checking for other people or animals, but all I saw were more shifting shadows. It was as though multiple shapes were paralleling our run, staying close to the brush and moving with us. The speed they kept was impossible. My mind went into overdrive, every nerve screaming that we were in danger. Finally, I yelled something about stopping, but James refused. We slowed only for a moment because Eric, who was in front, had started to hyperventilate. We caught up to him, half lifting him by the arms to keep him moving. He started to say, "Don't look behind us." The instant he did, my curiosity overcame me, and I glanced back. That's when I saw what made my blood run cold. A dismembered figure walked behind us, missing its head at the neck in a way that looked like it had been ripped off, and from its knees down there was nothing. The form floated or moved forward with no legs. I could see no details, just the outline in that partial starlight. Yet I knew it was shaped like a man, though so impossibly cut up. We stumbled forward again, afraid to keep looking. But there was no question we weren't imagining this. We pressed onward, ignoring aches and stitches in our sides. As if all that wasn't terrifying enough, once we reached the area near the main road, the sense of being followed by swirling shadows vanished. Yet nature didn't revert to normal. Instead, we heard a coyote's distressed yelps maybe 15 or 20 feet off the trail in the brush. It sounded like it was being attacked, letting out guttural screeches that no typical fight or scuffle produces. Then an awful noise replaced the coyote's howling. The distinct, wet sound of flesh tearing, bones cracking. The coyote's cries cut off in seconds, leaving only that grisly munching that lasted a moment longer. The reality of such a savage kill so close by petrified us. It seemed like the horror was not confined to intangible spirits. Something violent was physically present in the darkness. We needed no further incentive to run the last stretch to the car. My lungs burned, but adrenaline propelled me. The entire time, we heard rustling at our sides, as though something was matching our pace from the shadows. It was the worst feeling I've ever known, that primal terror, an awareness that any misstep might lead to being pounced on. At last, the parked car came into view, and I fumbled for the key fob in my pocket. The beep-beep unlocking the doors felt like the sweetest sound. We threw ourselves into the seats without even buckling. I twisted the ignition, the engine roared, and we peeled away. We didn't say much on the drive. I recall Eric mumbling about how the scary dairy lived up to its name, how we should have never come. James was breathing heavily, cursing to himself. My own hands were trembling on the wheel. We had planned to check out the old main building too, but that was unthinkable now. Our nerves were shot. We instead decided to drive to a 24-hour diner for coffee, though once we got there, we couldn't muster an appetite and we parted ways soon after. The memory haunted me for days. I questioned if it was a shared hallucination, but how could four people have the same intense illusions, complete with the same horrors? The next time I saw James, he told me he had nightmares about the tall shadow figure. Eric refused to discuss it, claiming he'd blocked it from his mind. The scariest part might have been that coyote's final yelp. That reminded us it wasn't all intangible illusions. Something physically dangerous was out there, too. I was naive enough to go back eventually, hoping to prove to myself that I hadn't imagined it. But that second trip was no better, possibly worse. That's a story for another time, but it confirmed there are places in our world that defy easy explanation. I'm 23 now, no longer the reckless 18-year-old, but I carry the knowledge that not everything can be neatly categorized or rationalized. The events at the scary dairy, those shape-shifting shadows, the legless phantom, the coyote's savage end, stand as a reminder that some corners of reality are darker and more inexplicable than we'd like to believe. Even if you're not seeking them, they can find you, lurking in the quiet nighttime edges of an abandoned barn or trailing you along a lonely trail. Sometimes you're lucky to leave with only a story. It happened about a year ago in Great Falls, Montana, when I was living in a camper with my boyfriend, Chris, and my friend T. It was wintertime, and at night the cold would bite through the walls of the RV. The three of us had trouble sleeping, and our phones had all died. Because we had no power in the camper, Chris and I decided we'd head to the bank down the street to charge our phones. I guess it felt like the simplest solution at the time. We knew the bank had posts outside with accessible outlets we could use. The night was quiet and dark, the kind of winter night where you hear every sound echo a little louder in the cold air. We reached the bank, plugged in our phones, and waited for them to charge. Standing there, trying to keep warm, I heard a strange noise that immediately put me on edge. I glanced around to see what it was. Not far from where we stood, there was a tree, maybe 3 feet away. In that faint illumination provided by the bank's lights, I noticed something that made my stomach lurch. A woman was standing in the middle of that tree's shadow, silently and motionless, just staring right at me. I froze, and a jolt of fear shot through me. Keeping my voice low, I leaned over to Chris and whispered, "Do you see that woman by that tree?" He squinted, searched the area with his eyes for a moment, then shook his head. "What woman? I don't see anyone." My heart kicked harder. I knew I wasn't imagining things. She was so clearly there, just standing in the darkness. I glanced back and, sure enough, she was still there. Same spot, same intense stare. The realization that Chris couldn't see her made me even more unsettled. I turned my gaze upward, trying to calm down, but that's when I noticed something even more bizarre. On 2 branches of the tree, about level with my line of sight, I saw what looked like figures perched on either side. On the left branch, I could see 6 tiny shapes that I somehow knew were babies. On the right branch, there were 6 children, older than the infants but still small in stature. At that point, my thoughts started to race. The woman below the branches was still fixed in place, and as I peered around, I realized there were more of these silent figures off in the distance, each one just watching. In total, I think I saw 16 more, scattered around, half concealed by darkness or behind objects. Each of them stared in my direction. Off to the side, near the entrance of the bank, I spotted a bench underneath another tree. Sitting there was an elderly couple. Even from a distance, I understood they were the same type of figures as the woman, the babies, and the children, shadowy beings that didn't seem entirely human. The moment I noticed them, strange voices began to echo in my ears. They spoke, but not in any language I recognized. I hurried to grab my phone, which had gained just enough charge to boot up. With shaky hands, I pulled up Google Translate, desperately trying to see if I could pick out anything intelligible. As I listened, repeating snippets of what I heard into the phone's microphone, the words on the screen formed some sort of story. Each phrase or sentence would appear, describing some background of the figures, who they were, how they'd come to be. But when it came to the woman in the tree, her part of the story seemed incomplete or hadn't been revealed yet. Eventually, the phone displayed the words "end of scene," and in an instant, the entire group, babies, children, woman, old couple, all of them vanished from my view. I turned to Chris, voice unsteady, and told him we needed to leave. We started to gather our things, but before we could fully pack up and go, I heard more voices. My phone flickered and lost service, but I could still hear them, so I tried to repeat the words I heard, memorizing them until we could get back to a place with Wi-Fi. The voices spoke again, and then I saw only the old couple and the woman. My phone's translator spat out the phrase "scene 2," and that was when I felt real terror locking up my limbs. The old couple stared, and the woman's mouth curled into a smile, the whitest, most unnerving grin I've ever seen. Something about the way she revealed her teeth felt predatory, like she was enjoying our fear. I yelled at them, telling them they weren't real, that they were just in my head, but of course, they stayed put, ignoring my desperate denial. That was it for me. My chest pounded with panic. Chris must have seen the panic on my face. We started running, not caring how foolish it looked. While we scrambled off, we could hear the voices continuing in the dark. With no cell service, all I could do was repeat the words out loud, making sure to remember them exactly so I could check Google Translate later. Once we reached the camper, where T was probably asleep, I typed the words in as fast as I could. The translation made my blood run cold. Run! When the woman smiles, you're in danger. My hands shook as I read it, and I realized we'd been seconds away from something worse happening. It was almost like these entities or illusions or whatever they were had given us a warning, or maybe a threat. Through my tears, I forced myself to peek out of the camper window, heart hammering. Across the road, under a lone streetlight, that old couple from the bench sat like silent sentinels, as if they had followed us all the way home. I was too terrified to keep watching. When I finally looked again, they were gone. I haven't returned to that bank at night since. Even just the thought of driving past it in the dark makes me queasy. I have no explanation for what I saw. Whether it was some supernatural phenomenon, a collective hallucination, or something specifically tied to that land. But I know what I experienced. The sight of those impossible figures, the half-understood voices telling their stories, that disturbing grin on the woman's face. All of it burned itself into my memory. It remains the single most chilling event of my life. To this day, I sometimes wake up from nightmares where I see her face in the tree, all those babies perched on branches, and that old couple reappearing in the distance, continuing their cryptic conversation. And always, I remember the words, "Run!" When the woman smiles, "You're in danger." I was 11 when my parents finally bought their own home. It was a 2-story house with a large backyard and even a swimming pool, which felt like a dream come true. My dad was probably the happiest of all, since we'd always lived in rentals that never allowed pets. He wanted us to have a dog, so once we moved in, we got a yellow lab named Boomer. A year later, we added a schnauzer mix named Misty to our family. The dogs stayed outside most of the time except for bad weather or evenings when we wanted them indoors. In California, it rarely rains or storms, so we spent hours in the backyard playing with the dogs. That backyard was massive because our house stood near the center of a small cul-de-sac, making the property wedge-shaped. The front yard was narrow, but the back spread out wide behind the house. Stretching along the back of the house was a large wooden deck, running from one side to the other. My parents' bedroom was located on one end of the house. On that same side, part of the deck had a little roof covering it, a simple awning. A wooden fence also separated the main portion of the backyard from the narrower side yard. Behind that fence, there was a metal screen door, the sort that squeaked when you swung it open. We used it to move between the backyard and the side yard. This deck and fence door became significant for reasons I didn't grasp until a bit later. When I think back, I can't remember exactly how long we'd been living there before we noticed anything strange. Perhaps it started within our first year or two, though the activity kept going until I was in my late 20s, even after I'd moved out. I remember my mother being the first one to encounter something unusual. Early one morning, she was in her bedroom getting ready for work. She later told me that she heard the metal door outside open and close. Then, heavy footsteps stomped across the deck just outside her window. It was as if a large person in boots walked around, but when she dared to look, she saw no one. Our dogs, Boomer and Misty, stayed silent, not even barking. Over the next few years, my mom occasionally heard similar footsteps circling around the house, sometimes near her window, sometimes near the fence door. The odd events didn't stop with footsteps. One summer, my siblings and I, still kids, were allowed to stay home alone for the first time. On a bright afternoon, we lounged around in the dining room, talking and goofing off. Then, from above us, we heard someone walk around, specifically in my bedroom upstairs. We all froze. My brother and sister exchanged worried glances, and I felt my heart skip. Determined to protect ourselves, we grabbed kitchen knives, trembling, and crept up the stairs. I couldn't have been older than 12 or 13, with my youngest sibling being around 9. About halfway up, the footsteps stopped, so by the time we reached my room, it was silent. Naturally, we found nobody. That was the first time we armed ourselves in our own home, spooked by the notion of an intruder who wasn't actually there. As time passed, we got accustomed to these happenings. Strange sounds became part of the house's character. Heavy footsteps on the ground floor, along the deck, or up in my room. Late at night, I'd sometimes hear shuffling papers, as if someone sifted through my desk or the stuff on my floor. Once in a while, I'd feel a soft touch on my shoulder or back, the way someone would press against you to squeeze by in a crowded room. And on the rarest occasions, a rosy perfume that didn't match anything my mother or sister owned would fill the air. It was never overwhelming, just a gentle scent appearing briefly. I remember a day when I was in my parents' bedroom, using the mirror on the sliding closet door. Abruptly, the door slammed shut with enough force to rattle me. Another time, my older cousin lived with us for a while. After she moved out, my sister took that same room. She soon realized she had to lock her door at night because if she didn't, the handle would jiggle nonstop, as though someone tried to enter. It was never violent enough to break in, but it persisted for hours. Most nights, she'd hear the rattle until she yelled at it to stop. These events, weird as they were, almost felt like part of the house's routine. One night, my sister woke up to see the silhouette of a man standing by her bed, touching her forehead as if checking for fever. He spoke softly, muttered something like, "No, that's not good," then turned and vanished. A short time later, she fell seriously ill with the swine flu that was going around. She felt certain it was a warning of some kind. When my mom told us the previous owner of the house had been a California Highway Patrol officer who died of cancer in her bedroom, it started to click. My bedroom had once been his office. My sister's room had belonged to his daughter. We began to think he was the spirit wandering the house, continuing his fatherly routine or simply lingering after his passing. It was oddly comforting, but the atmosphere gradually shifted. Something heavier settled in, felt darker. I became uneasy around my youngest sibling's room at the top of the stairs, like a presence lurked in the corner, watching. I dreaded passing that open doorway, as though I might glimpse a shadow or, worse, get pulled inside. Going downstairs became nerve-wracking too, because I always imagined something pushing me from behind. The tension in the house seemed to increase as my youngest sibling grew more withdrawn. They struggled with acceptance from my parents, who meant well but never fully embraced the fact that all of us kids were LGBT. My sibling turned to drinking a lot. The more they drank, the more they stayed cooped up in their room, the more oppressive the feeling in the house became. It was a suffocating aura that settled into every corner. By 2015, when I was an adult, I experienced something truly terrifying. My parents were away, though I can't recall exactly where. My younger sibling might have been out too, since the house was quiet. My sister was at work and had taken Misty with her. That left me with only my cats and my new dog, Rue, a sweet border collie. Night had fallen and I was in the living room. The only lights on were in that living room. I heard it first, slow, heavy footsteps descending the stairs in the dining room behind me. My stomach clenched. The sound was nothing like the familiar footsteps we'd grown used to. These were heavier, menacing. Rue was dozing, not reacting at all. Meanwhile, I was frozen in place, heart pounding. The steps reached the ground floor, crossing from the dining area toward the kitchen. With each creak of the floor, I could tell exactly where it was, as our house was slightly raised above the ground, making the boards resonate. It was methodical, like it was searching for something. Soon, the footsteps closed in on the threshold between the kitchen and living room, just a short distance behind me. I refused to look that way, afraid of what might be standing in the dark. My entire body felt rigid, and the air thickened, as if a hand closed around my lungs. Finally, I whispered, "Rue," in a tight, urgent tone. She jerked awake, stood, and locked eyes on the darkness in the doorway. She growled, baring her teeth, a response I'd never seen from her before. She's the sweetest dog, friendly to a fault. My eyes flicked that way, but I saw nothing except the dim shape of the doorway. Yet Rue's unrelenting growling assured me something stood there, even if my eyes couldn't detect it. After a few seconds, the tension ratcheted up. I was sure it would stride into the living room and do God knows what. Then, as quickly as it came, it seemed to dissipate. Rue kept growling until we heard my sister's key in the front door. She walked in with Misty behind her, and immediately, the awful presence disappeared. The living room's atmosphere returned to normal. Rue quieted, though she remained uneasy, staring at the doorway with her hackles half raised. I felt dizzy with relief. It wasn't the end of the bizarre experiences, but it stood out as the worst so far. The next significant event happened about a year later. My sister had started a webcomic that gained some popularity, so she spent hours at her desk in her bedroom, drawing. I was in there with her one evening, chatting while she searched for reference images online. She joked about using some questionable sites to look up satanic symbols for a storyline. I sat on the floor, leaning against her bed, while she worked at her computer. Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed movement. A shadowy shape caught my attention. At first, I assumed it was a trick of the lamp. But as I watched more closely, the figure moved in a steady, looping path around the room. It walked in a counterclockwise circle, passing behind my sister, pausing as if to peer at her screen, then continuing around, even moving through furniture. It was three-dimensional, a distinct presence of shadow, not just a silhouette on the wall. I tried waving my hand near the lamp, looking for some rational reason, but found none. The shape was unaffected, continuing its circuit. Every so often, it paused behind me, as if it was studying me too, then carried on. My heart pounded, but I couldn't tear. My gaze away. Eventually, I announced that I was leaving. The thing unsettled me deeply, and I didn't want to watch it anymore. My sister asked if everything was fine, but I simply told her I didn't feel comfortable in her room just then. Later that same night, my sister woke up needing to use the bathroom. She opened her closet, which was near her desk, to grab a pair of shorts. As she bent down, she heard a low, guttural growl inches from her face. In terror, she abandoned her plan to dress and rushed to the bathroom, all while praying nobody else in the house would see her running in fear. She told me the next day that she decided to take this old painting of Jesus, one that had survived a house fire in my mother's childhood, and place it in the closet. After that, she reported no further shadowy manifestations in her room. Despite our misgivings, we attempted a small Ouija session in her room one night, hoping to communicate with the original spirit, the presumably friendly officer we believed had died there. We'd been drinking a bit, so perhaps it wasn't our wisest choice. We asked questions, got slight movements on the board that suggested something was present. My sister grew impatient, demanding more concrete proof, even insulting it. When we ended, we politely said goodbye, or as polite as two half-drunken siblings could be. Then, heading to the kitchen to set aside our cups, we found the sink water running full blast. Neither of us had turned it on. We took that as a sign we shouldn't push our luck. Maybe it was that policeman's spirit or another presence making a statement. Eventually, I got married and my sister roomed with me for a while. She and a friend encountered brief paranormal activity in our new apartment, though that's another story. My sister soon developed a health issue that forced her to move back into our childhood home after our lease was up. By then, I was out of there permanently, but she stayed in my old bedroom. One night, she woke to an awful stench of rot and ammonia hanging in the air. The ceiling fan, which wasn't turned on, was swinging almost violently in circles. That was new. My bedroom, in all those years, never had poltergeist-like activity. As soon as she saw it, she recalled the painting of Jesus, placed it in that room, and the problem vanished. Eventually, my parents sold the house and moved. Their new place feels lighter, untroubled by that oppressive aura we'd grown used to. I noticed that within minutes of stepping inside, it lacks the heaviness I associated with my childhood home. These days, I'm no longer scared of the dark corners the way I was back then. The malevolent presence that clung to the walls of our old place doesn't shadow my thoughts the same way. But the memories remain. I can easily recall the feeling of being watched on the stairs, the dread of thinking some force might push me, the unseen footsteps that came and went, or how my dog growled at something I couldn't see. I'm relieved that my family no longer lives in that environment, and none of us have had experiences as intense as those. Sure, I still ponder the policeman's spirit, the possibility that at first we were sharing our home with a benign figure. But something else later seeped in, a different entity that escalated the fear and overshadowed any trace of kindness left behind. That malevolence, that sense of malice, is something I never want to live through again. A part of me is sure that painting of Jesus saved my sister from worse harm more than once. Maybe it was just a focal point for belief, or maybe it's truly an object blessed by circumstance. No matter the explanation, I can't forget the bizarre events that shaped our years in that house. I can't forget hearing footsteps that matched no living person's presence, or the hush that fell whenever someone realized the dogs never reacted to the noises. I can't forget the oppressive feeling that grew as my sibling grew more reclusive, or the day I felt a distinct, heavy presence cross from the stairs to the living room, stopping just behind me. Rue's protective growl resonates in my memory. Even in the face of something invisible, she stood guard. Those experiences taught me that it's not always a simple, harmless haunting. There are times when the energy becomes something else, something that weighs on the spirit and warps the atmosphere of a place. Time has moved on, but every so often, I'll mention to my siblings or my mother how strange it is that we shared that house for so many years, coexisting with an unseen occupant, or perhaps multiple occupants, each with different intentions. We never uncovered a precise reason for the shift from harmless to oppressive. Maybe it was triggered by emotional turmoil, like the tension around my siblings' struggles. Maybe that negativity drew in a darker presence. I don't have a definite answer, but I'm grateful we don't have to live in the middle of that swirling darkness anymore. In the end, while part of me is curious about the unknown, I've had more than my fill of real, frightening experiences. Curiosity no longer outweighs caution. There's a line between indulging that slight thrill of a ghostly phenomenon and being stuck in a place that stifles your peace. As I recall everything that happened, footsteps, strange scents, closet doors slamming, glimpses of shadows, my mind always returns to the day I felt a cold, heavy presence watch me from a few feet away, with my dog the only one who could sense what was truly there. That memory alone is enough to tell me how truly powerless one can feel against something intangible. I never want to experience such powerlessness again. I only traveled to Republic because my mother was there. I hadn't lived with her for 2 years. I left when I was 20, and now I was 22. She'd called to say she was lonely, that ever since my father left her when I was little, the house had begun to feel increasingly empty. I couldn't deny her request. I'd always had a soft spot for my mom, even though I'd moved away to build my own life. Hearing how sad she sounded made me pack my bags and go back, if only to keep her company for a while. I remember arriving in Republic on an overcast afternoon. The clouds hung low, as if hinting at a storm, and the wind brushed through the thin trees by the side of the road. After a bit of driving around, I had to admit I'd forgotten her exact street. It had been so long, and my mother had moved from the place I grew up in. So I pulled over, took out my phone, and called her. The line rang, and after a moment, her familiar voice answered, warm and eager. She told me her address, and I drove on, noticing how much the town had changed. A few new buildings stood where empty lots used to be, and I passed by a row of shops that looked recently built. Still, there were old, familiar places here and there, a small diner, a park with a rusted swing set. When I reached her house, she was waiting by the doorway. The moment I got out of the car, she hurried down the short path and pulled me into a tight hug, like she always did when I was a child. I felt that old, comforting presence as if no time had passed. We chatted for a bit outside, taking in the mild breeze that carried the faint smell of someone's dinner cooking down the block. Then we went inside. The house felt cozy, with warm lighting and various decorations from her earlier years spread across shelves. Family photos framed in mismatched patterns hung on the walls, capturing moments from my childhood and earlier times. We spent a long time catching up in the living room. My mom had never been one for silence. She filled the air with stories about neighbors, about a small group of women she'd started meeting for coffee, about how she'd occasionally get phone calls from relatives. Even as a child, I remember her always on the phone, talking rapidly. I used to think it was dull, just adult talk about groceries or local gossip. Now, I listened more carefully, aware that these glimpses of her life were a sign of how she was doing. She told me how some days she felt fine, and others she felt the emptiness of the house too strongly. Her voice carried that mixture of relief and sadness you hear when someone has lived alone for too long. Later, I followed her into the kitchen where she was preparing something for dinner. Perhaps a stew, judging by the smell of onions and spices that simmered in a pot. A small radio on the counter crackled with static, failing to pick up any station clearly. She beckoned me closer. "There's a missing ingredient," she said, rummaging through a cabinet. "Would you mind going out to pick it up? The store's not far. It's close to the gas station down the street." I agreed like it was second nature. I enjoyed solitary walks, even in the evening. I remembered how my mother had taught me basic self-defense. She never raised me to be timid, especially after my father left. She always wanted me to be prepared, so I felt confident about going out alone, though the day was fast sliding into evening. Darkness was settling across Republic. The sun had fully sunk beneath the horizon, leaving a faint afterglow behind the clouds. The air had that strange mix of a mild chill and a leftover warmth from the day. I set off, noticing how few people were out. Maybe they were all home for dinner, or maybe it was just a quiet part of town. Still, I was on alert, scanning the sidewalks and alleys. Old habits of caution emerged. My mother's voice echoed in my mind. "Always keep your head up, trust your instincts." The store was a modest place, a bit run down but serviceable. I found the item my mom wanted and paid at the single register. The clerk barely glanced at me, bored or tired, as though he'd seen 1,000 customers that day. I said thanks and stepped back out into the street. By then, night had properly fallen. A solitary street lamp buzzed overhead, casting a yellowish cone of light onto the asphalt. I started walking home, my mind drifting from thoughts of dinner to random childhood memories. That's when I felt it. A creeping unease, like a low-level warning in the back of my head. It wasn't immediate dread. It was more like each footstep added weight to the sense that something was off. I tried to keep rational, telling myself it was just me being jumpy in the dark, in a place that wasn't fully familiar. But the feeling grew stronger, as if a cold presence hovered right behind me. I clutched my bag more tightly, remembering the small knife I carried. My mother taught me how to handle it, how to hold it properly if someone tried to grab me. At some point, I paused, scanning the street. It was deserted. The flickering overhead lamp made shadows stretch and distort across the pavement. My gaze roamed over parked cars, windows of houses with closed blinds, and the faint silhouette of trees in the distance. Then I noticed something. Far down the sidewalk, a figure stood. My first assumption was that it could be anyone. A neighbor, a passerby, a random local. People sometimes stand still to check their phones or look for something in their bag. But as I watched, this person didn't move at all. I realized with a jolt that they were almost unnaturally motionless, as if they were a statue placed in the middle of the sidewalk. A chill ran through me. The figure looked around 6 feet tall, definitely taller than me by a good margin, but that alone meant nothing. What froze me was the impossibility of how still they were. My breathing quickened, and a wave of apprehension shot through my body. Telling myself not to panic, I lifted my phone and flicked on the flashlight app, shining it toward them to confirm what I was seeing. In normal circumstances, shining a light on a person reveals their features, their clothes, their face, something. But my light only seemed to vanish into the silhouette, as though it was being sucked in. I saw no eyes, no glimmer of reflection. Instead, I saw a void, pitch black, darker than a normal shadow. For a moment, I felt my entire body lock up. My mind screamed run, but my legs refused to budge. I recalled how, in horror movies, the protagonist never moves right away when the monster is right there. This was that feeling, the raw freeze of real terror. Then it started to move. But the motion was bizarre, jerky, glitch-like, sort of how a broken video game character teleports forward then backward with no natural flow. Each flicker of movement brought it closer. My throat tightened. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. The figure seemed to be toying with me, bridging distance in quick, unnatural spurts. Suddenly, out of the corner of my eye, I saw another figure materialize. Just blinked into existence a few steps to my left. And then another one behind me, then another one to my right. 4 of them in total, each shaped like a faceless shadow, each bounding with that weird glitchy motion. Before I could react, they arranged themselves in a circle around me. It was a position that cut off any possible route of escape. Even though they had no visible eyes, I felt the intensity of their focus on me, a maliciousness that was nearly tangible. My phone began to buzz in my hand. The screen lit up, displaying my mother's name. Something about that phone call jarred me enough to move. Reflexively, I answered. "Hello," I managed, voice trembling. The moment I spoke, I realized the figures were gone. No swoosh or fade out, just gone, as if they had never been there. My mother's voice came through, worried. "Are you okay? Where are you? Did you get lost?" Her words brought me back to reality. I took a shaky breath. "No, I'm fine," I lied. "I had a bit of confusion at the store, but I'm on my way." She told me to hurry up and hung up. I stood there, alone again, as if the entire event had been a hallucination. I scanned the shadows around me, half expecting those figures to appear once more, but the street was empty and still. My heart pounded. I wondered if I'd completely lost my mind or if that was a real encounter. Nonetheless, I started walking again, quicker this time, nearly jogging the last few blocks to the house. The second I stepped through the door, my mom asked, "Everything okay?" I forced a small smile and shrugged, handing her the grocery bag. I just said, "Yeah." Took longer than I expected. That night, as I lay in bed, I replayed the whole scenario. Could I have imagined it? But it had felt so real. The oppressive sense of malice, the absolute blackness of those silhouettes that devoured the light from my phone, and the terrifying way they flickered around, like they were skipping frames in reality. My mother wouldn't have believed me if I told her about shadow figures in the street. She'd probably chalk it up to me being paranoid in a town I hadn't visited in a while. Even now, months later, I can't erase that memory. Whenever I close my eyes and think of Republic at night, I see those beings cornering me, invisible malice in their stances. I recall the deep freeze in my limbs, the same phenomenon characters in horror stories talk about when they see something inhuman. I keep telling myself it was stress, or some illusions in the dark. But part of me is convinced I witnessed something beyond normal explanation. The abrupt disappearance when my mom called, was it just a coincidence? Maybe the phone's ring broke the tension, or maybe these things are repelled by human connection. I have no idea. Since that incident, I've never walked around that part of town after sunset. The memory of that encounter is enough to put me off any late-night strolls. There's a residual sense that those shadows might still be lurking, waiting for me to appear so they can surround me again. Sometimes I think about how easily they corralled me in place. They moved with intelligence, not just random wandering. The 4 of them formed a perimeter, making sure there was nowhere to run. I also wonder why they stopped or why they didn't escalate. Part of me thinks maybe they enjoy fear, that they feed on it, and once the tension was broken by my mother's call, they lost interest. Another part of me suspects that if I'd done anything differently, like if I tried to dash away the moment I saw them, maybe the outcome wouldn't have been so fortunate. The questions swirl around, but I have no real answers. All I know is that I trust my instincts more than ever. That wave of dread came for a reason, telling me something was off long before I saw the first figure. Next time I get that kind of gut feeling, I'll be more cautious, maybe turn around or seek a place with people around. Because there are things in this world that defy rational understanding, at least for me. Some are mild and vanish quickly, but they leave a mark on your psyche, reminding you that reality can have edges we're not used to dealing with. I still talk to my mother regularly, but I've never shared the story of that night. I tell her all is fine whenever she asks about my short walks or errands. She probably doesn't suspect a thing. In her eyes, I remain the self-assured daughter she raised, able to handle any normal threat. But neither of us expected the threat of intangible, possibly supernatural shapes drifting through the darkness. If I ever do mention it, she might laugh it off or become worried that I'm seeing ghosts. so it's better left unsaid. I can deal with the memory on my own. Sometimes I dream about those silhouettes. In the dream, they appear in the corner of a room or outside a window. They don't do anything except watch. But the malevolence is always there, sending chills through my sleeping mind. I wake up, chest tight, glancing around to reassure myself that I'm alone. The feeling fades by daylight, replaced by a subdued sense that I shouldn't dismiss the experience as pure imagination. In the end, I've returned to my own life. I keep in touch with my mother, and I occasionally visit but rarely stay past sundown. If I have to, I make sure I have a ride so I'm not walking alone. It's a small adjustment in my habits, but it helps ease my nerves. Part of me thinks it's silly to let fear from a single strange event impact my routines. Yet I can't quite let it go. The memory of how quickly they materialized and blocked me and stays with me. I'd rather be safe than sorry. So that's it. That's the story. Just me. A winter evening in Republic. A quick trip to the store that turned into an unforgettable fright. No grand finale or swirling vortex of darkness. Just 4 black figures flickering into existence, then vanishing when my phone rang. Did it actually happen? I'm convinced it did, though I can't prove it. I cling to the details as proof that I'm not losing it. The overshadowing sense that something truly supernatural might roam the streets after nightfall is enough to keep me from going back out alone in the dark. I suppose I can live with that caution. Better safe than confronted by those 4 unnaturally solid shadows again. I remember how my friend Johnson and I were almost at the end of our enlistments in the U.S. Army. We were stationed at Fort Bliss, way down near El Paso, and we thought we'd seen our share of odd details and chores. The Army has a habit of giving you menial tasks out of nowhere. Setting up a ceremony, unloading crates of ammunition, maybe even volunteering to make a parade look more impressive. So when someone said they needed people for a civilians on the battlefield role-playing exercise, we shrugged. It was just another assignment, probably a week or 2 of pretending to be local townspeople while a training unit did their field problem. They gathered about 10 of us from random units, Johnson and me from our infantry unit, plus a scattering of cooks, supply clerks, maybe a finance guy or 2. We didn't really care. They gave us the outline of the job. We'd drive up to a place called Zambrania, a big, dusty training village in southern New Mexico, about an hour north of Fort Bliss. Our role was to pretend to be neutral civilians caught in a military conflict so a unit could practice dealing with people who weren't the enemy. All we had to do was live in this fake town for a week or 2, wait for the training unit to arrive, and interact with them in ways that tested their patience and their approach to civilians. It sounded more interesting than loading trucks or sweeping a motor pool, so I was fine with it. The name Zambrania sounded odd. Someone in our group spelled it differently every time, but basically, it was a cinderblock ghost town built exclusively for military exercises. Anyway, after a couple of days of prep, they loaded us into trucks and dropped us off in that deserted place. Maybe 25 or 30 structures stood scattered around a few dusty roads. Some buildings were actual cinderblock shells, others were shipping containers that had windows and doors cut into them. In the middle, 2 large 4-story structures faced each other across a main road, presumably to simulate tall office or apartment buildings. We had minimal supervision. A sergeant would come daily from Fort Bliss, bring us water, rations, check we were still alive. Then he'd leave again. At least half the group was a bit spooked from the start. Something about a ghost town, built not for real residents but for practice. The air felt stale, as though it carried the memory of thousands of boots running drills, but no genuine life. Johnson and I just told each other it was a chance to relax. For me, it felt like a mini deployment minus any actual danger. The place was out in the wide-open desert, with nothing but sagebrush and cacti around it. We saw the occasional rabbit, oryx, and 1 or 2 tarantulas, but otherwise it was emptiness. We settled into one of the bigger cinderblock buildings labeled as a church. It had a rickety wooden door, a few pews made of battered wood, and a narrow staircase winding up to a fake bell tower. We found a small fake cemetery in the back, complete with a few tombstone props that looked suspiciously heavy and real. At first, we all chose to sleep there, piling our sleeping bags on the floor, because it was relatively clean. It was definitely more stable than the shipping container huts. I should mention the group itself was an odd mishmash. You had me, an infantry medic, often just called Document. I was also the only woman in the group, which didn't bother me much. My best friend, Johnson, was a full-blooded infantryman. The typical unstoppable grunt who'd run toward a gunfight without hesitation. Then you had Sanchez, a field artillery guy, plus a handful of supply and admin soldiers. It became clear early on that none of them really wanted to be in charge. Johnson ended up taking a sort of leadership role by default, just because he was the most decisive. He didn't like being in charge, but it happened naturally. The plan was for us to be there for at least 2 weeks, maybe a bit longer, waiting until the main training unit arrived. They'd be out in the field doing a mock war scenario, eventually rolling into Zambrania. We were to act like regular townspeople, cooking, complaining, wandering around, maybe staging a riot if the higher-ups told us to. Meanwhile, we lived there with no showers, just bottled water, MREs, and a few porta-potties. We had no forced schedule, just a daily check from that sergeant with supplies. Honestly, it was the best detail I'd ever gotten. Usually, details are tedious or physically demanding. This one felt like an extended camping trip, though the environment felt vaguely creepy. After a few days of playing cards, exploring the cinderblock alleyways, rummaging in shipping container shops, we got used to the place. Yet there was something about an artificially constructed town that unnerved us. Several times we discovered hidden tunnels under certain buildings, presumably for other exercises. Some led to dead ends, a few joined basements of the 2 tall 4-story buildings in the center, letting you cross from one building to the other in secret. We joked about how we'd use those tunnels to surprise the training unit once they showed up. Anyway, the unsettling vibe wasn't just about the emptiness or the dust. At times, 1 or 2 of the younger guys would swear they heard footsteps in a building that was supposed to be empty or glimpsed a shape darting around a corner. Johnson and I mostly brushed it off. In a place that big, with random tunnels, it was easy for illusions to form in your mind, especially at night. None of us were rookies with ghost stories. The army alone provides plenty of them in old barracks or deserted training sites, so we'd heard our share. We tried not to dwell on it. One evening, right around dusk, we'd gathered in the church to eat. Our routine was straightforward. We'd set up candles or small battery lanterns inside, spread out MRE packs, and talk. The desert outside was turning dark, the sky striped with orange and pink, and the breeze carried in a slight chill. Our big black garbage bags, filled with MRE trash and such, sat in the entryway near the door, about 10 feet from the bottom of the winding staircase that led to the bell tower. Johnson and Sanchez finished their meal and grabbed their trash, intending to toss it in the bigger dump area we designated behind one of the shipping container huts. I was across the room, picking up a few leftover items, when I noticed them freeze just past the open double doors that led from the main room to the entryway. They were side by side, each clutching a garbage bag, and they both looked up the staircase. Neither said a word, but their body language shouted alarm. They turned around, wide-eyed, and jumped back into the main room. Some of the others also noticed how rattled they seemed. Immediately, I stepped closer and said, "What's wrong?" Johnson hesitated, a glint of anxiety in his eyes. For 2 men trained as infantry, it was rare to see genuine fear. But there it was, plain as day. Finally, Sanchez spoke up, his voice shaky. "We saw someone on the stairs," he said. "Some white figure just walking up." Johnson confirmed it, nodding rapidly. They described seeing a shape move along the steps, heading to the first landing, then vanish around the corner as if it took the next flight. The weird part was how it disappeared. There was nowhere to go but up, and if a flesh and blood person had been there, they would have heard more footsteps or glimpsed them continuing. But the stairs were silent. They said the figure looked somewhat translucent, or at least not entirely solid. When they went to check the stairwell, it was empty. No one was up there, and they couldn't see any sign of a presence. I glanced at them, half expecting a grin or some comedic reveal, but they were too spooked for it to be a prank. Johnson's attitude changed from relaxed to on guard. "We're not sleeping here tonight," he muttered. Nobody argued, especially with the look on Sanchez's face. Without much debate, we decided to relocate to another building we liked, one of the cinderblock structures with working electricity. It was just across a small courtyard, so we didn't have to go far. A few of the other guys joined us, presumably not wanting to remain in the haunted church. By the time we arrived in the new building, it was fully night. The overhead lights in that structure gave a bit more comfort, though the rest of Zambrania loomed dark and silent outside the windows. Johnson and Sanchez retold their experience to the group, describing the figure's shape in detail. Some believed them, others were uncertain. But they were clearly rattled. Johnson, typically stoic, kept fidgeting, scanning corners, and it made the rest of us uneasy. I asked if I should go back to the church to fetch anything else, maybe see if the figure was still around, but Johnson gave me a look. "You're crazy," he said. "If you want to, do it, but I'm telling you we're not going back there till morning." I ended up going back briefly, collecting a few small items we'd left behind. I'll admit part of me wanted to see if I could catch a glimpse of this ghostly presence. Nothing happened. I returned safely, though with my heart thumping in my chest just from the atmosphere. For the rest of our time in Zambrania, maybe another week, nobody else reported seeing anything. We stuck to the new building mostly, used the shipping containers to store gear, or roamed the town by day. Eventually, the training unit arrived, and our job kicked in. We played the role of civilians, tried to cause friction with the soldiers by staging a protest, complaining they were too loud, or crossing their perimeter lines when they told us to stay put. The comedic side was that we were half bored and half delighted to be messing with these guys. They dealt with us as best they could, sometimes ignoring us, sometimes trying to bribe us with MRE snacks to keep us calm. When the entire operation wrapped up and we returned to base, Johnson and I reflected that it had been the most entertaining detail we'd ever been assigned, except for that encounter in the church. Johnson sometimes brought it up in passing. "You remember that weird white shape on the stairs?" The memory lingered, a reminder that even on a remote army training site, you can run into something you can't explain. Over time, the story became just another piece of army lore we carried. We never determined if it was truly supernatural, a trick of the light, or some imagination triggered by the creepiness of the setting. Yet Johnson swore it was real, and I trust him. He's not one to spook easily. He and I remain close, even though we've parted ways since leaving active duty. We occasionally chat online, and sometimes, if we're reminiscing about weird moments in the army, we'll recall Zambrania and the shadowless figure on the stairs. I find it interesting that none of us saw anything else overtly paranormal during our stay, but that single incident was enough to shape our entire memory of the place. It gave that desert ghost town an extra edge of eeriness. The rotting couch in the police station, the cement floors, the reeking porta potties, and the shipping container houses all blend into the background compared to the short glimpse of that white figure and the wide-eyed terror on my friends' faces. No matter what truly happened, that day in the church remains a highlight of an otherwise dull assignment. In the end, I chalk it up to one of those strange army stories. Some platoons talk about hearing screams in old abandoned bunkers. Others claim to have seen apparitions in the older sections of a base. For me, the memory of a shape climbing a flight of stairs in a fake church stands out as my personal brush with something unexplained. Nobody was hurt, nothing followed us home, but it left its mark on us. A small reminder that there are corners of this world, even man-made ones, where unexplainable things can appear. I was 14 years old when this happened, and at the time I was living in Mexico with my family. It was the rainy season, which meant that nearly every evening, dark clouds gathered overhead. The rain would typically begin in the late afternoon, intensify at night, and sometimes keep going until dawn. Because I was used to living in this region, I knew the rain often brought about rivers that formed out of dry creek beds, turning them into rushing waters. It was something everyone in the neighborhood learned to navigate, from older folks to little kids, because the roads and fields would flood in unpredictable ways. One day I was at home, but I visited my cousins often. They lived nearby, up a slight hill at the edge of a small town. The older cousin was about 16, and his younger brother was my age. They'd come over to my house, or I'd go to theirs, and we'd spend hours playing games, watching TV, or just talking about random stuff. On this particular day, my older cousin was telling us he'd heard La Llorona the previous night. If you're not from Mexico, La Llorona is a well-known legend. A woman's voice wailing in the darkness, searching for her lost children, or so the story goes. People say that if you hear her crying, it's often a bad sign, or that she's drawn to places with water, like rivers or lakes. When my cousin said he'd heard La Llorona, I laughed, along with his younger brother, because we were all somewhat into the paranormal. We liked ghost stories, told them to spook each other, but never really believed that such an iconic legend would show up in our actual lives. It was one thing to chat about monsters or ghosts, but it was another to claim La Llorona had walked right by your window. We teased him a bit, but he stayed serious. He insisted he had truly heard her the night before, wailing in the distance. He told us his place was especially prone to weird happenings because a river formed behind his house whenever it rained heavily. I remembered that, in rainy season, a gully near his backyard turned into a small, rushing stream. My cousin said La Llorona would appear there, wandering the water's edge. He was convinced, after hearing her once, that she might show up again. He asked if I wanted to sleep over that night to see for myself. My younger cousin and I exchanged glances. Part of us was nervous, but I was also curious. Maybe we'd just end up sharing ghost stories, watch a storm pass over, and that'd be the end of it. So I agreed. I grabbed a small backpack with pajamas, a spare shirt, and my toothbrush, told my parents I was spending the night. They thought nothing of it. They were used to me hanging out with my cousins, and I suspect they didn't believe in La Llorona any more than I did at the time. When dusk came, we gathered at my cousin's place. The air outside was damp, the sky a dull gray. We were inside the living room, flipping through channels on TV. My aunt and uncle were around, but it was getting late, and they turned in early. By around midnight, the living room was ours. We huddled with blankets on the couch, the TV volume low. It was a typical scene, me, my younger cousin, and the older cousin who swore he heard La Llorona. We whispered about random topics, occasionally glancing at the windows. The steady drum of rain on the roof made the atmosphere cozy but also slightly tense, especially with the earlier rumor of the wailing woman fresh in our minds. A couple of hours passed like that, the rain continuing outside, and soon it was near 3 in the morning. The TV played some late-night program we weren't really paying attention to. Suddenly, I noticed my older cousin pull the blanket over his head. He pressed himself against the couch as if trying to hide. Immediately, I asked him, "What are you doing?" He didn't answer at first. Then he mumbled that it was about to happen, exactly like last night. The same sequence of events. First the dogs, then the cats, then the chickens and cows, and finally everything would fall silent. I exchanged a skeptical look with the younger cousin. "What are you talking about?" I asked, but a chill crept into my voice. My older cousin just said, "The dogs will start barking any second." Right on cue, distant barking cut through the sound of rain. It wasn't just one dog, but several, scattered across the neighborhood, building into a chorus of frantic howls. I felt the hair on my arms rise. My older cousin, hidden under the blanket, continued, "Next, the cats will start fighting." Right after he said that, we heard those unmistakable yowls of cats battling near the front yard, an eerie mixture of hisses and shrieks. Then he said, "Now the chickens and cows go crazy." And sure enough, we could hear the squawk of chickens in someone's yard and the distressed lowing of a cow or two from a neighbor's property. It was the strangest meltdown of farm animals all at once, echoing into the early morning darkness. At this point, I was thoroughly spooked. My younger cousin pressed closer to me, eyes wide. My older cousin was trembling so much I could see the blanket quiver. Then he said, "And then they'll all stop at the same time." A moment later, as if obeying an invisible command, the barking, yowling, clucking, and mooing cut off, leaving a jarring silence. Even the rain seemed to hush. It was as though the entire night had paused to listen to something we couldn't hear yet. The hush was so total that not even a cricket chirped. My older cousin muttered from under the blanket, "She's coming. She's coming." I felt a knot twist in my stomach. As much as I wanted to act tough, hearing the animals all lose their minds then abruptly stop was unnerving. "Who's coming?" I asked, even though deep down I already knew. He didn't answer, but the tension in the air made it clear. Then, In the distance, I heard it, a long, mournful wail, drifting through the darkness. It rose in pitch, then faded, echoing as though traveling along the wet roads and fields. My heart pounded as I recognized the cry that legends call La Llorona, the weeping woman. I proposed that we try to see if there was anyone outside. A trick of the wind, maybe. But my older cousin was too paralyzed with fear to budge from his blanket. The younger cousin was also frightened, but a spark of curiosity overcame him, so we both stood. Step by step, we edged toward a window near the back door. The wailing came again, this time from the opposite direction. It sounded as though the voice was moving, floating along the roads, circling the house. "Wait until it sounds far," I whispered to my younger cousin. "Then we'll open the window and peek." He nodded, swallowing hard. The wail rose once more, and it seemed slightly farther away. We took a step, but a sudden noise from behind us made the younger cousin shriek. He jumped back, nearly knocking me over. His scream triggered my own terror, and I scrambled away from the door, nearly tripping. The wail from outside grew quiet again, as if listening to our panic. By then, we were both next to the older cousin, cowering near the couch. My chest hurt from breathing so fast, and every muscle felt tight. We huddled together, waiting for more sounds, but the wailing abruptly stopped. The silence that followed was almost worse. I realized I was clutching my younger cousin's arm. After a minute, we forced ourselves to breathe normally, but each of us was trembling. Eventually, around the first hint of dawn, we drifted into a restless sleep. We told ourselves maybe it was just a nightmare or some kind of cosmic trick. Morning brought sunshine and the usual bustle of the small neighborhood. My aunt, who woke early to start cooking, found the three of us bleary-eyed in the living room. When we told our uncles and my grandma what had happened, most of them laughed it off. They said we were telling tall tales. My grandma, however, took on a serious expression. She told us quietly that when you hear La Llorona wailing close, it might mean she's actually far. But if you hear her sounding far away, that's when she's near. She was convinced that if one of us had actually looked out the window or stepped outside, we might have had a direct encounter that ended badly. That sobered us. I replayed how the wails had traveled up and down the street 3 times, making it impossible to tell if she was near or far. Maybe we were lucky we never peeked. Reflecting on it now, I wonder if my older cousin's story about hearing her the previous night was the same phenomenon. He described the dogs barking, the cats fighting, the farm animals going wild, then abrupt silence. I guess that's how the cycle repeats each time she appears. It's as if all living creatures sense something unearthly before we do. Did I truly hear La Llorona that night? Or was it just a bizarre alignment of coincidences? Some stray dog or coyote inciting the others? A gust of wind making a wail? The terrifying synergy of all the animals plus the intense hush and the distinct, mournful cry felt too specific to be random. I never told many people about that experience. Even my own parents heard only a shortened version. My mother suspected it was teenage overimagination. But a part of me can't forget the raw tension in the air, like the atmosphere itself knew something malevolent was passing through. That image of the 3 of us, one under the blanket, the other 2 standing in a half-lit living room, hearts pounding, hoping not to see a ghostly figure outside. It's embedded in my memory. And the next morning, the memory of that silence, deeper than any normal hush, made me shiver. Now, years later, I sometimes recall the hush of the desert-like outskirts of that town. If it's a rainy season, or if I find myself alone at night, I think of the howls of neighborhood dogs that might signal something approaching. In many ways, La Llorona is just a folktale, but like all good legends, it's rooted in a collective fear of something intangible and sorrowful. Maybe the reason the animals sense her presence is because they respond to that primordial grief and dread. Or maybe there's no explanation at all. In any case, that night shaped how I see the legend. It's no longer just a story I heard from older relatives or on a YouTube channel. I experienced enough to respect it. My grandma's warning that when she sounds close, she's far, and when she sounds far, she's near resonates like a riddle. It also suggests something about illusions and misdirection. The idea that you might attempt to find her when she sounds far, only for her to be right behind you. Even now, if I hear stray dogs bark in the middle of a drizzly night, my mind goes back to that living room, the steady thrumming of rain on the roof, and my cousin's trembling voice saying, "She's coming, she's coming." The memory is as vivid as the day it happened. I suppose that's how legends live on, not just through stories repeated by our elders, but through personal encounters that make us question everything we assume about folklore versus reality. Though I might never know what truly took place that night, the experience remains with me, just as potent as any real danger could be. It's a testament to the power of both the mind's imagination and the weight of cultural myths that seep into our bones from childhood. In the end, I trust my senses enough to say something extraordinary occurred. The animals truly flipped out, the hush truly descended, and that eerie wail truly echoed in the darkness. The next time it rains heavily, I'll probably recall the entire event, from the flickering TV to the final hush, reliving it in memory. And maybe I'll keep an ear out for that faint, far-off cry, just in case. When I was growing up, my family lived on a ranch where my father used to work. I couldn't really tell you how big it was in acres, but as a kid, it felt like the entire world. Fields stretched out in all directions with tall grass for the cows, scattered groves of trees, and a few rough roads leading out to the main highway. We had other animals around. Goats, horses, and sometimes wild pigs lurking out by the fences. Back then, I thought living there was normal, but as I got older, I realized not everyone wakes up to the sound of roosters or sees cows grazing as soon as they step out the front door. My dad disappeared from our lives when I was still very young, around 6 years old. He left, never gave a reason, and my mom never talked about it much. She just focused on keeping the household running. My little brother and I tried our best to help, feeding the animals or doing minor chores, though we were only kids, so we mostly just did what we were told. My mom eventually found another job, one that required her to drive into town early each morning. Because we lived so far out on the ranch, she had a lengthy commute. This meant she left the house around 4 in the morning, long before the sun was up. She'd wake my brother and me, make sure we got dressed for school, fix us a simple breakfast, then head out. The bus would come for us sometime around 5 or 5:30. That bus schedule changed depending on which route the driver decided to take that morning, so every day was a bit unpredictable. Our ranch had 2 main gates. One was usually locked, so the bus driver either had to get off the bus to unlock it or go around to the main entrance. Some mornings, he felt lazy or pressed for time, so he'd skip the locked gate and circle around a longer route, which might cause him to come even earlier or later than usual. It was a bit of a toss-up. Because of that, my brother and I got used to standing by the gate in the dark for a good while, scanning the road for the headlights of the bus. We'd chat quietly or sometimes just stare at the stars, which were brilliantly bright out in the countryside. It was normal for us, although from an outsider's perspective, 2 children standing alone in the dark at 5 in the morning might sound unsettling. I remember that the mornings were cold, especially during certain times of the year. In rainy season, the chill in the air was noticeable and we wore jackets or sweaters. My brother was younger than me, so I tried to look out for him, even though we had normal sibling spats. On one morning in particular, the air was damp, and we could feel the moisture from a recent rainfall in the ground beneath our feet. The gravel road glistened slightly under the faint glow of a distant ranch light, and the smell of wet soil drifted around us. We had fed some of the smaller animals already, chickens and goats, and we'd patted the heads of a few curious cows that wandered close to the fence. Then we took our usual positions near the gate, my brother on one side of the driveway, me on the other, waiting for the telltale rumble of our bus's engine. There were plenty of cows out that morning, though that wasn't strange in itself. A ranch is full of them, after all. We noticed a white calf nursing from its mother, who was also a pale shade of white. It was a soft, almost ghostly color under the dim light. We didn't pay them much attention, since it's not like cows recognized us personally. We thought it was just another typical day. The bus was late or maybe early. We couldn't be sure. My brother kept glancing up the road, and I'd ask him, "Do you see the bus?" He'd reply, "No, do you?" We went back and forth a few times, more to break the silence than anything. Then I saw my brother's expression change. He stopped whispering about the bus and stared over my shoulder, his face shifting from neutral to alarm. Immediately, I guessed maybe the mother cow was acting protective or some large bull had come up behind me. Sometimes a bull would wander closer and you had to be cautious. So I turned around slowly, expecting to see a cow lowering its head or a bull snorting. But that wasn't it at all. What I did see has stayed in my mind for nearly 36 years. I've replayed the moment in my thoughts more times than I can count, questioning whether it was real. But it felt real, so vividly that I can still picture it. Standing by the cow was a man, except he had no head on his shoulders. Despite that, he moved as if nothing was wrong. He was wearing a checkered suit, like something from old photos you might find in a trunk in someone's attic, complete with a bow tie. At his side rested a strange carpet bag, the sort with a handle on top. He was crouching or maybe sitting, but there was nothing beneath him, so it looked like he was sitting on thin air. And unbelievably, it seemed like he was milking the mother cow. A wave of disbelief washed over me. The rational part of my brain insisted that people can't be headless, that this had to be some trick of the light, a weird shape or shadow. But I saw the checkered pattern of his suit, and I saw him leaning forward as if drawing milk from the cow, even though the father part of the scene was truly impossible to explain. Then he not turned his head because he didn't have one, but turned his shoulders toward us. I had this paralyzing certainty that he was looking at us, even though there was no face or eyes to see. My brother must have thought the same because he started running. So did I. I dropped whatever I was holding. My books, my lunch, I can't remember, and bolted after him. We sprinted back up the driveway toward the house, hearts pounding. In the early morning darkness, it felt like a nightmare, yet we knew we were fully awake. We reached the house and tumbled inside, heading straight for the washroom or screened-in porch area. We tried to quiet our breathing, listening intently for footsteps or any noise. Then we heard it, something moving inside the house. It sounded like boots or perhaps spurs, that distinct clinking as if a person was walking across a wooden floor. Fear seized me and I clung to my brother. We realized we might not be safe in the house, so we ran out the back door to find help. There was a hunting camp behind our place, and we remembered a neighbor or caretaker living near it. We decided to run there, hoping that someone would be awake. As we tore through the yard toward the camp, we encountered a crowd of wild pigs milling around in the darkness. Maybe 100 of them, or so it seemed. Wild pigs can be extremely dangerous, able to gore or trample you if they feel cornered. So we skidded to a stop, scanning for a way around them. They were huddled so thickly that it seemed impossible to pass. With no other option, we jumped up onto a picnic table standing out in the open. My brother and I clutched each other, half crying, trying not to draw attention from the pigs. I squeezed my eyes shut, expecting them to close in on us, but when I opened them a second later, they were gone. Every single pig had vanished, as if they'd never been there. It was unbelievably eerie. Maybe they ran off into the brush quietly, but we heard no scuffling or snorting. Nothing. It felt like we were caught in some twisted dream. First a headless man, then spurs in the house, then a vanished herd of wild pigs. We hopped down from the picnic table, ran further, and pounded on the door of the caretaker's home. Our frantic knocks must have jolted him awake. He came out wearing a belt lined with bullets, like a scene from an old western, and holding a gun. We babbled about seeing a man with no head, hearing footsteps in our house, encountering 100 pigs that disappeared. He stared at us like we were insane, but we insisted we weren't joking. He agreed to help and walked with us back to the house, gun at the ready. Every step made me anxious, expecting to see that headless figure or the wild pigs. But when we reached the front door, all was silent. He searched the rooms, checked outside, found no trace of anything strange. No footprints, no hoof marks, no sign that a mysterious man had ever been there. He shrugged and said we must have had a terrible scare or maybe let our imaginations run wild. Then he left, telling us to calm down. Within minutes, our school bus arrived, headlights blazing up the dirt road. I grabbed new shoes, since I'd lost my sandals in our mad dash. and hopped onto the bus, ignoring the questioning stares of the few other kids aboard. My brother and I sat in the back, breathing heavily. As the bus pulled out, we passed the mama cow again. There was nothing unusual by her side, just the white calf. No checkered suit figure, no sign that anything had ever happened. Later that day, after we got home, we explained it all to our mom. She just shook her head, probably thinking we were overtired or had let a creepy shadow spook us. In her mind, we were kids with wild imaginations. She told us to ignore these fantasies, but we insisted it felt real. I can still see the details in my head. The old-fashioned suit, the bag, the milking posture, the white color of that headless shape. For the rest of our time on that ranch, I dreaded every early morning. My dad was gone, my mom had to leave for work, so that left us waiting alone for the bus. Eventually, my mom decided it was best if my dad's brother or some older relative would wait with us at the gate, or at least keep an eye on us from a window. My brother and I never again saw the headless man or the ghostly pigs. Yet the memory lingered. Even as an adult, I recall the texture of that fear. I try to rationalize it. Maybe the morning shadows played tricks on our eyes, maybe the wild pigs were never as many as we thought, or we spooked them and they fled. Maybe the footsteps in the house were just the old boards creaking. But deep down, it still feels like we encountered something beyond logic. Some nights, I dream about that figure in the checkered suit, silently milking a cow with no face, no expression, only the intangible sense that he turned to look at us with invisible eyes. I wonder if it was a ghost from the ranch's past, or some manifestation of leftover energy from another era. My brother rarely talks about it, but I know he remembers. We occasionally exchange a passing reference. Remember that time with the headless man? And then let the conversation drop, because even now it gives us a shiver. Despite all of that, life on the ranch continued. Over the years, we moved away, each forging our own path. We rarely visited the ranch again, not because of that event alone, but because circumstances changed. My mom got a new job in town, and we found ourselves transitioning to a more urban environment. But if I ever find myself standing in a lonely farmland under a dark sky, I half expect to see a white calf or a checkered figure out of the corner of my eye. And I can't help but reflect on how strange that morning was, how powerless we felt, and how it left a lasting mark on my sense of the world. So that's my story. The memory of a headless man in an old suit, a bizarre cameo of ghostly pigs, and the echo of spurs on wooden floors remains with me decades later, an unexplainable encounter in a life that otherwise was fairly routine. I don't claim to know if it was a spirit or a trick of the mind. All I know is that, in that moment, fear was real enough to make us run, to make us cry, to make us question what might be lurking at the edges of our everyday life. And sometimes, in the corners of memory, I still see him. He's by that cow, leaning forward with his checkered suit, waiting for unsuspecting passers-by in the early hours before dawn. I've always been the type to look for the most mundane explanation for strange events. I don't dismiss the possibility of ghosts or the paranormal, but I generally believe that most weird occurrences have simple, natural causes once you dig deep enough. I've owned an older home for a while now, and it apparently has something of a reputation in the neighborhood. My coworker's daughter was good friends with someone who used to live here, and those girls claimed to hear strange noises in one of the upstairs bedrooms. Given that it's an older place, it's not hard to guess where those noises might come from. Wooden floors and walls settle and creak. Plus there's the attic with its potential rodent activity. In fact, I've personally heard the occasional scratching from inside the walls, which is almost certainly squirrels or mice. Not very thrilling, but it makes sense. Even though other people might spin a ghost story out of it, I see it as just the normal quirks of an aging house. That attitude forms the backdrop for my two experiences. Despite my skepticism, these moments stand apart from the rest of my life in that they defy the straightforward, material explanations I usually rely on. They happened years apart and in totally different locations, yet both took place in the same city. I don't have any mental health issues, no history of hallucinations, no substance use that might induce wild visions. I'm about as ordinary as they come in that respect. Still, these two incidents baffle me. I can't explain them in any practical way, and they linger in my mind whenever I think about what might be out there, beyond easy understanding. The first one happened around 2007, inside a Walmart. Yes, a Walmart, arguably one of the most mundane places imaginable. I was a college student at the time, and my class schedule left me with an awkward 3-hour gap between courses. Rather than just sit on campus, I decided to drive over to the local Walmart to browse the aisles and maybe buy something random. It wasn't a busy day. The store was mostly quiet, and even the background music overhead seemed dialed down. I was wandering aimlessly, pushing a cart with no real plan, just killing time. At some point, I passed by the jewelry section. The next thing I knew, I felt and heard a loud whisper right in my ear. A sharp, angry hiss that spoke my name. I distinctly remember that it felt like a person's breath, hot against my skin, as though someone had leaned in close to me. The voice itself was undeniably hostile in tone, almost as if someone had built up frustration and decided to call my name under their breath. My immediate reaction was to spin around and see who was there, expecting to catch some friend or acquaintance playing a bizarre prank. But the aisle was empty. In fact, the nearest person was at least 30 feet away, near the electronics department or somewhere else. There was absolutely nobody in the immediate area. I checked behind displays, even took a few steps around, but found no sign that anyone had dashed off. What sticks with me is the lack of fear I felt. You would think that hearing a disembodied voice speak your name would send chills down your spine. And I was startled, yes, but not truly terrified. More like intensely curious and a bit unsettled. I tried to replay the situation in my head. Could it have been a malfunction of the store's PA system? Some weird auditory glitch? But why my name? Whispered in an angry tone. I've considered the possibility of some quick hallucination or a momentary misinterpretation of a sound, but it was so specific and so real that I struggle to write it off as imagination. Over the years since that day, there have been rare moments in the mornings when I've half awoken from a deep sleep and thought I heard my name, but those times I chalk up to that drowsy in-between state. This Walmart incident, however, happened in broad daylight, fully awake, with a cart in front of me and my eyes wide open. I guess I'd love to find a rational explanation, but so far, I have none. It remains in my memory as an unexplainable encounter that defied the normal. Still, I tried to put it behind me by telling myself it was a once-off, an anomaly strange but not indicative of anything bigger. And life went on. Fast forward about 7 or 8 years to around 2016. By then, I was living in a new apartment on the second floor of a duplex. The ground floor was rented out to a woman and her daughters, while I had the upper level to myself. The place had a decent layout, a small bedroom, a modest kitchen, and a living area. It wasn't fancy, but it suited my needs at the time. I'd been living there for maybe 2 weeks when something odd happened. The woman downstairs and her kids were out that day, and I had the apartment all to myself. The neighborhood in general was quiet except for the cars passing on a nearby highway. Because I had a peaceful day ahead of me, I decided to sit down and meditate, something I'd been practicing for about 6 years. It's not an elaborate ritual. I just sit cross-legged, not quite a lotus posture, which I can't do comfortably, close my eyes and focus on my breathing. It helps clear my head and relieve stress. That afternoon, I positioned myself in the bedroom, sitting with my back to the bed, facing the wall so I had some stability. A few minutes in, I reached that calm state where you start letting go of stray thoughts. My breathing was slow and measured. The highway noise became background static that my mind tuned out. Suddenly, my focus was disrupted by the sound and sensation of someone walking into the room. The footfalls were heavy enough for me to sense the floor giving slightly under each step. It felt like a person with noticeable weight approaching from the doorway. My immediate reaction was annoyance, thinking that maybe the downstairs neighbor had come up to knock on my door or something, but I remembered the front door was locked. This person continued moving until they stood right behind me. I could almost feel a presence lingering there. Then there was a slight thump, as though whoever it was decided to sit or flop down on the floor next to me. I opened my eyes, fully expecting to see someone there, but the space was empty. The bedroom was still. The only sound was my own breathing and the faint murmur of traffic outside. No one was behind me. No one had come through the locked door or stepped past me. Yet the experience of hearing distinct footsteps, feeling the weight shift on the floor, and perceiving that final little thud was as vivid as anything. Oddly, I didn't panic. Much like the Walmart whisper, I wasn't scared or threatened. The presence felt more curious than aggressive, as if it wanted to figure out what I was doing. A sense of calm replaced my momentary confusion, and I sat there for a while, waiting to see if anything else would happen. Nothing did. Eventually, I got up, looked around the apartment, checked the locks, and concluded that I was still alone. No further oddities occurred in that apartment. Not once did I hear footsteps or sense that presence again. It was as if whatever or whoever that was showed up for a single moment, then vanished. I can't see an easy explanation for that. Could it have been a dreamlike state brought on by deep meditation? Possibly. Yet I've meditated for years, and nothing like that had ever happened before or since. I wasn't drifting off to sleep. I was still alert. The sensation of footsteps behind me was so concrete, I felt the floor shift. That's not something that can be easily dismissed as a figment of my imagination. Both these experiences, the Walmart whisper and the apartment footsteps, lack the typical drama people associate with ghost stories. There's no mention of flickering lights, no objects moving on their own, no apparitions in the corner of my eye, no sense of dread or some malevolent figure lurking in the shadows. Instead, they both felt brief, personal, and oddly unthreatening. In the Walmart case, the whisper sounded angry, but I wasn't afraid. In the apartment, the presence just felt curious, and again I wasn't afraid. I find it interesting that both times, I had a calm reaction. Perhaps if the experiences had been more overtly menacing, I would have reacted differently. Still, for a skeptic like me, these incidents are perplexing. I can't dismiss them as easily as I have with stories about squeaky houses or alleged apparitions that turn out to be headlights shining through a window. I've spent nights rethinking the possibilities. For the Walmart episode, maybe it was some random glitch in my auditory processing. But that wouldn't explain the sensation of breath on my ear. For the apartment footsteps, maybe my mind was playing tricks on me from a deep meditative state. But the weight on the floor? That felt real enough that I momentarily believed a person was physically there. I've told these stories to a few friends. Most just nod politely, uncertain how to respond. People who believe in ghosts or spirits might say I'd encountered something from another plane, while the hardcore skeptics suggest I was overly tired, or maybe I misinterpreted random sounds. Part of me remains open to those rational alternatives, but neither situation fits my usual categories for illusions. This leaves me in a state of unresolved curiosity. I keep recalling the distinct hiss of my name and the distinct sound of footsteps in an otherwise empty space. In the years since, nothing quite like them has happened again. Yes, I occasionally get the feeling that someone said my name when I'm half asleep, but that's easy to chalk up to my sleepy brain. And I've never felt footsteps behind me in another meditative session. My life has moved on with no further experiences that defy a boring, natural explanation. Maybe that's for the best. Maybe these events were simply flukes, one-time phenomena that exist outside the usual pattern. They remind me that not everything can be pinned down, that occasionally the world slips out of neat scientific confines. Reflecting on it all, I remain a skeptic, though a more humbled one. I don't jump to labeling these experiences as ghosts or otherworldly visitors. But I can't deny that I can't explain them either. They sit in a little category of puzzling memories I carry around. Maybe one day I'll have the key to solving them, or maybe the solution is buried in some branch of psychology or physics that I'm not aware of. Until then, I continue living my life much as I did before, comfortable with the idea that a few mysteries might never be solved to my satisfaction. In a world filled with illusions, scientific wonders, and the complexities of the human mind, there's room for a couple of enigmas that keep me quietly wondering. I remember the day I got a call from Marcus, asking if I wanted to join him on an urban exploration trip not too far from where he lived. Because I've always had a fascination with abandoned places, and I've dealt with spirits in my own house, I said yes right away. My place is haunted by mischievous energies, but they've never felt dangerous. I was curious to see what we might find in another empty house nearby. Still, I didn't realize that this exploration would bring me face to face with something that felt a lot more threatening than any spirits I was used to. We decided to meet at a bar in town before heading over. So I arrived there first and spotted Marcus at a table. He waved me over and I walked up, calling out, "Yo, Marcus, how's it hanging?" He grinned and said, "Dude, look at all this stuff I brought," and pulled out an array of gear. 2 walkie-talkies, 3 flashlights, a couple of EMF detectors, and even a spirit box. I remember laughing, saying, "Are we ghost hunting or something?" But before Marcus could reply, I heard someone sigh beside him. A voice followed, "You seriously asked him to help as well?" I glanced over and realized it was Kiera, my ex-girlfriend. Immediately, a surge of anger ran through me. We hadn't parted on friendly terms, so I snapped, "Why is she here, man? You know what happened." Marcus raised his hands in a gesture meant to calm us both. "Enough hostility, okay? I can't explore this place by myself, and I asked both of you for help. You two need to be civil for one night." Kiera and I looked at each other. I felt a familiar tension in my chest, but I swallowed it down. Finally, I said, "Fine." She gave me a narrow-eyed look and echoed, "Fine for now." We left the bar and walked a few blocks to the house Marcus wanted to explore. The closer we got, the more I could sense the quiet of the neighborhood. It was late enough that most people had gone to sleep, and the streetlights flickered over empty sidewalks. The house itself was bigger than I expected. 2 stories with a dark, empty look to the windows. Some of the paint had peeled off and the yard was overgrown. Marcus handed us the flashlights and walkie-talkies, gave me an EMF detector and a spirit box, then turned to the building with excitement. He was practically bouncing on his feet. I rolled my eyes at his energy. "Come on, man. How old are you? Jumping around like a kid." Marcus just grinned. "We're both in our 20s, so I'm allowed." Kiera sighed, "I'm really glad I never dated you," which made him laugh but settle down. We stopped outside the front door. Marcus quickly announced, "I'll take the ground floor and the cellar. You two check out the first and second floors." I braced for Kiera to protest, but she only said, "Fine. That means he'll actually have to talk to me." I could feel my anger flare briefly at her jab, but I let it drop. We stepped inside and my first thought was that it smelled damp, like old wood and stale air. The moonlight came in faintly through a few cracks in the boarded windows. We fanned out, Marcus heading downstairs while Kiera and I walked through the entry hall and up a creaking set of stairs to the first floor. Kiera took the lead, shining her flashlight ahead. I hung back a bit, scanning each room we passed. After a few steps, she suddenly whirled around, shouting, "Hey, hands off the merchandise." I jumped back, startled. "What's your problem? Why are you yelling like that?" She glared at me, eyes full of anger. Something just touched me. My heart beat faster. I snapped back. "Why assume it's me? I'm holding the EMF and the spirit box. My hands are full." She paused, looking around, her fury subsiding a bit. "Well, something touched me. I don't know what it was, but I felt it." She took a few steps forward again, rubbing her arm like she was uncomfortable. The hallway opened into a large room that was full of old, broken furniture. Some chairs lay toppled over. Dust coated every surface, and the air felt heavy, almost charged. Every so often, Kiera would grunt or curse under her breath, squirming like she felt a hand on her. After around an hour of this, she lost her temper completely. She grabbed one of the chairs and hurled it against the wall. "Whoever's touching me, cut it out." Her outburst reminded me of the night I discovered her cheating. She'd looked almost the same, angry, cornered. "Hey, calm down," I said. "We could try the EMF and spirit box. Maybe we can figure out who's messing with you." She took a breath, nodded, and muttered, "I'm actually glad you still call me Key. It's been a while since anyone did." I stayed quiet, not sure how to respond, and started setting up the EMF detector. Suddenly, we heard a voice, a male whisper, and it was so clear it sent chills along my arms. It said, "They are all mine." I spun around, shining my flashlight every which way, but saw no one. Kiera said, "You heard that too, right?" I just nodded. I decided to try provoking it. "If you're the one who's been touching Kiera, make this EMF go all red." In an instant, the lights shot up to the red zone. That had never happened to me before, and my throat went dry. Kiera, trying to keep her composure, said, "If you have a thing for girls, go red again." And sure enough, the lights spiked to red again. At that moment, a loud "BOO" crackled through the walkie-talkie, scaring us both half to death. Kiera snatched the walkie and started yelling, cursing at Marcus for pulling a stupid prank. Once she finished her tirade, I took the walkie from her. "Marcus, that better be your only joke tonight, man. We're talking to something real here." I called him a dumb nickname, something about cucumber pants, which made Kiera look at me weird. "Long story," I muttered. Marcus apologized, said he was still trying to get into the cellar but it wouldn't budge. We told him to go ahead and keep exploring, just not to scare us like that again. After that, we tried asking more questions, but whatever we'd been communicating with seemed to vanish. The EMF stayed flat, and Kiera reported no further touches. Eventually, we found our way to the stairs leading up to the second floor. Kiera suddenly sighed in relief, muttering something like, "Finally, no more hands on my merchandise." She gave a small laugh when I teased her about it, and I felt an unexpected pang of nostalgia. I once loved that smile. Before I could dwell on it, I heard a faint little girl's voice whisper, "He is gone." I whipped around, searching the hallway behind us, but found nothing. Kiera noticed my frantic movement. "You look like you just saw a ghost. What happened?" She put a hand on my cheek, and for a moment I felt close to her again. I explained that I heard a girl's voice. She stared at me as though trying to gauge whether I was joking. Then we climbed the steps to the second floor, stepping onto old, dusty floorboards at the top. No sooner had we arrived than a loud thud echoed from the corridor. A small ball rolled across the floor in front of us. I tried to pretend it was no big deal, mumbling, "Maybe it's just the wind." We both knew that was a flimsy explanation, but we wanted some comfort. Then came thudding footsteps from the floor below. I grabbed the walkie and asked Marcus if he was moving. "Around a lot." He replied, "No, I'm still at the ground floor trying to get into the cellar." "Why?" Kiera added, "We just heard footsteps, and I've been touched for the last 2 hours, but it wasn't Tay." Marcus fell silent for a moment, and we heard girlish laughter over the static. Kiera and I exchanged worried looks. Another loud thud reverberated, and Kiera let out a scream. I saw tears glistening in her eyes. I reached up to brush her hair behind her ear, trying to calm her. She sniffled, and we heard a third thud somewhere in the room behind us. "That's enough," I said, frustration creeping in. "I'm setting up the spirit box right here." Kiera tried to grab my arm, seeming nervous, but I was determined. Once I turned the box on, we both sat down. She held my hand, trembling a bit. "Okay, who rolled the ball?" I asked. Static crackled, and then a small girl's voice said, "Ally." Kiera's eyes widened, and her grip on my hand tightened. "Ally, why are you still here?" I pressed. The same voice answered, "Here to stop." She sounded younger than I'd expected. Kiera leaned closer to the device. "Are you trying to stop the person who touched me?" she asked. "Yes, he evil," the spirit box replied. Kiera's face paled. She whispered to me that she felt nauseous. The next words from the spirit box were, "That's him." Kiera clapped a hand over her mouth, looking like she was about to be sick. I practically begged her, "Ki, go outside. I don't want you getting worse." She hesitated, asking if I'd be okay. I nodded, seeing how shaky she was. We stood, and I helped her to the stairs, supporting her until she made it down. Then I returned to the spirit box. "Who made her sick?" I demanded. A cold male voice answered, "I did. She is mine now." My blood ran cold. "What kind of sicko are you?" I shouted. Suddenly, I heard approaching thuds in the hallway, but they stopped short. The girl's voice echoed once more through the box. "Is she safe?" I got up and looked out the window. I spotted Kiera outside, walking in circles, checking her phone. I quickly texted her, telling her to sit still so she wouldn't aggravate her nausea. She glanced up at me through the glass, then typed something on her screen. My phone buzzed. "I'm fine now, but it seems you have some help from the young girl next to you." I spun around, but saw no one. Right then, the male voice on the spirit box snarled, "Get out." It was more forceful than before. I glanced outside again, seeing Kiera safe on the lawn, then felt a weird sensation. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end, and I heard the girl's voice right next to my ear, whispering, "Get out. He is here." Something in the room clattered. I turned to see the spirit box flying off the table, smashing against the wall. Terror shot through me, and I backed out of the room. The hallway lights seemed to dim, or maybe my eyes were playing tricks on me. My flashlight flickered, weakening. I tried the walkie to call Marcus, but I got only static. Suddenly, all the doors up here slammed shut at once with an echoing bang. The force rattled the walls. My heart was pounding, but rage bubbled up alongside my fear. I yelled, "You're the one who made Key sick, right? Show yourself." Silence. I started losing my temper. "You're a coward if you hide like this." The moment that sentence left my mouth, the doors all rattled hard, maybe 4 or 5 seconds of intense shaking. Then I heard a male voice, seemingly not from the spirit box this time, but echoing through the hall, "All girls are mine." At the far end of the corridor, I saw a tall, thin silhouette of a man. It didn't look quite human in its shape, stretched, blurred. Then, loud as anything, I heard, "Get out now." That was my breaking point. Without a second thought, I bolted toward the stairs, nearly stumbling in my haste. As I reached the first-floor landing, I heard the girl's voice again, "Please help." The sorrow in her tone made me hesitate. But then I heard violent crashing from deeper in the house, and my nerves couldn't take it. I hurried down to the ground floor. It was there that I noticed the cellar door rattling uncontrollably. It shook so hard I feared it might splinter. For a few seconds I just stared. Then I saw a small hand appear from underneath the door, as though someone was stuck down there. My mind screamed at me to run. I tore open the front door and stumbled outside. Gasping for breath, I turned back, expecting something to chase me. Instead, I felt Kiera's arms wrapping around me. She was crying, hugging me tightly. "Oh, thank God," she sobbed. "I thought something happened to you." Confused, I pried her off me and saw Marcus standing behind her, looking worried. "What are you talking about?" I asked. Kiera sank to her knees, still weeping. Marcus stepped forward, speaking quickly. "Dude, how did you get in and out so easily?" That question made no sense to me. I stammered. "What do you mean?" "I just walked out," Marcus explained. "You said over the walkie that you were in the cellar, and then a second later you said something collapsed on you, that you were dying." My jaw dropped. When did I say that? He insisted he heard my voice, that I was yelling about being trapped. Kiera nodded through her tears, confirming she'd heard it too. She said she wanted to rush in to save me, but Marcus told her to wait. She was convinced I was gone, that the house had done something to me. I glanced between the two of them, trying to make sense of it. But I never got into the cellar. The door was jammed. I never even tried to open it. Kiera shivered, wiping her cheeks. Marcus frowned. "All I know is that your voice came through the walkie. You sounded panicked. You said you had no chance of surviving. We tried calling you back, but it got lost in static." We all agreed to leave, though Marcus suggested we gather at the bar again to talk things over. Kiera and I walked off first, and I put my arm around her because she was still trembling. She told me softly, "I was sure you were gone. That voice on the walkie sounded just like you." I didn't know what to say. 10 minutes later, we sat in the bar, sipping whatever drinks we'd ordered, exhausted and shaken. Marcus joined us soon afterward. He mentioned that he'd set up a few cameras in the house before everything got too intense. He planned to retrieve them in the morning to see if they captured anything. The rest of that night was somewhat surreal. We tried to lighten the mood, returning to our old banter about silly topics, but we were all on edge. Eventually, we went our separate ways. I crashed at home around 6 in the morning, still trying to process the horrifying events. When I woke up late that afternoon, I found my phone flooded with messages. Kiera had written one that made my stomach drop. She said something like, "Marcus is messed up after seeing the footage. Nothing about it is normal." Marcus had also sent me files, a handful of pictures and some MP4 videos. I clicked on one of the videos, the first one labeled something about the cellar. The footage showed the cellar door from a slightly slanted angle, presumably from a camera he'd placed near the ground floor. My eyes widened as I saw the door shake violently. Then, under the gap at the bottom, a small hand appeared, reaching out. But what really got me was the male figure that stepped into view. It was tall and slim, exactly like the silhouette I'd seen. The recording's audio crackled, then a voice, the same male voice, spoke, "She is mine." My heart hammered in my chest. That single phrase brought it all back. The terrifying chase, Kiera's sickness, the frantic flight through those dark halls. We had encountered something beyond a simple haunting, something that was actively hostile and cunning enough to mimic my voice over the walkie. Even though I live in a haunted house with playful spirits, this was a different world of terror. As I replayed the video, I realized how close we'd come to something truly dangerous, how we were lucky to walk away. In some weird way, I also thought of the girl's spirit we heard, Ally, who tried to warn us. She might be trapped there, struggling against the malevolent presence. Looking back, I can't deny the fear. It grips my gut every time I recall that house. Kiera never quite talks about it, and we haven't repeated an exploration like that since. Marcus, for his part, says he'll never step foot on that property again. I don't blame him. Whatever roams that house, whatever calls out and claims to own every girl who enters, can have it. We survived, and that's enough. I'm used to ghostly happenings in my own home, but I'll take my mischievous poltergeists over that malevolent spirit any day. If anyone asks me about that place, I tell them not to go. Nothing is worth feeling the kind of dread I felt in those hallways, hearing that voice on the spirit box, or watching your friend, and even your ex, crumble under some invisible force's control. When I think about that last snippet of footage, the shadowed figure and the small hand under the cellar door, I feel a cold sensation behind my eyes. It's the memory of raw fear, the sense that something out there can manipulate people, throw its voice through electronics, and physically harm visitors. We were lucky to escape. I still wonder what might be lurking there, and if Ally, that girl's spirit, is still trying to protect unsuspecting explorers from the twisted entity that's claimed that ruin as its domain. I spent the earliest years of my childhood in a house that was already a century old, set in the outskirts of a small Midwestern town. The place was large and creaky, with floorboards that would let out long groans at night, and an attic that caught all the stray drafts. From a young age, I liked to roam around that house, stepping through the halls in my socks, popping my head into the attic for a peek whenever I could muster the bravery. It had its fair share of quirks, odd angles in the walls, spiderwebs that stretched high in the corners, and it stood by a small cluster of trees that swayed ominously whenever a storm rolled through. But at the time, I saw it all as an adventure. I made good friends in the neighborhood and rarely feared anything inside those walls. My biggest concerns revolved around how to climb the apple tree out back or how to convince my parents to let me stay outside a bit later every evening. Then, when I was around 10 or 11, my parents made the decision to sell the house. It caught me off guard because, for the longest time, I assumed we would remain there forever. I thought I'd grow up in that old house, marking my height on a doorframe each birthday and eventually leaving for college from the same front porch. But my parents wanted a change, possibly eyeing a job opportunity somewhere else, or maybe longing for a home in a more modern neighborhood. So they put the house on the market. Right around that time, everything started to shift for me, though I couldn't quite articulate it in those early stages. We happened to be selling during a period when real estate was sluggish. It took more than a year for the property to attract a serious buyer. That entire year, I was plagued by nightmares like I had never experienced before. I'd had bad dreams in the past. Like any kid, I'd wake up occasionally after dreaming about monsters or a scary movie scene. But these were different, more persistent and vivid. Night after night, they featured two figures, an old man and an old woman. The woman appeared more frequently than the man. She was tall and spindly, towering with a bony frame. She always wore a white dress of some kind, a gown or possibly a wedding dress, that swayed around her ankles when she moved. A gauzy veil often draped over her face, but in spite of that, I could see her features as clearly as if the veil were see-through. She had a gaunt complexion, sunken cheeks, and these intense, penetrating eyes set under bushy gray eyebrows. Her nose curved downward in a pronounced hook, and the wrinkles around her mouth gave her an almost perpetually grim look. The old man, in contrast, wore a pair of overalls, was short and stout, and simply lingered in the background of my dreams, less noticeable but always present. Initially, their appearances in my nightmares were more ominous than violent. I might be dreaming about playing in a field, running alongside my dog, when I'd spot her standing in the distance. She would just be there, silent, her head turned in my direction. That alone was unsettling enough, but as time went on, these dreams escalated. They became more threatening, more vivid, and even cyclical. I recall one dream especially well, in which I was shoved from the third-floor attic window of our house. That specific scene recurred many times. Other dreams brought worse scenarios, ones that, as a 10-year-old, I found impossible to fully process. There was an undercurrent of cruelty in them, painful and frightening events that were so out of my childish worldview that it was difficult to comprehend upon waking. As these nightmares increased in frequency and intensity, I began to mention them to my parents. At first, they dismissed them as typical bad dreams that a child might have, perhaps fueled by the stress of moving. But soon, something else started to happen. I woke up with cuts and bruises, scattered across my arms, legs, and even my torso. Some bruises looked like finger marks, others like I had fallen or been pushed. The cuts weren't deep, but they had no obvious origin. My parents found me quite distressed, so they took me to see a doctor. The doctor concluded that I must have been inflicting these injuries on myself, maybe while sleepwalking or having some stress reaction in my sleep. But I had no memory of doing anything like that. Even now, I can't recall a single instance of scratching or hitting myself. The best guess from professionals was that I was subconsciously harming myself out of anxiety, but it felt more complicated than that to me. Eventually, the nightmares got so severe that I dreaded bedtime. I'd do anything to avoid sleep, staying awake for as long as I could manage. There were nights I'd doze off from sheer exhaustion, only to jerk awake minutes later, sweating and terrified by yet another dream of that old woman and man. My grades slipped a bit at school because I was too tired to focus. My parents recognized the toll it took, but we had no alternative. The house was on the market and we had to wait for the right buyer. In a twisted sense, every time someone visited for a viewing, I crossed my fingers that they would love the place and put in an offer quickly. I wanted out, hopeful that leaving the house might also leave behind whatever caused these nightmares. Finally, about a year later, the house sold. I remember the day we packed up to move. Boxes were everywhere, stacked in the living room, hallways, and kitchen. My parents loaded them into the car or the moving van, while I trailed behind with the smaller items. Even though a big part of me was relieved, I also felt a sentimental sadness. This was my childhood home, after all. My mother asked me to check upstairs for anything we might have left behind. I climbed the familiar steps one last time, wandering into each bedroom. Eventually, I made my way to the attic, wanting to be sure we hadn't overlooked a corner. The attic was dusty and dim. Sunlight filtered through a small window, revealing swirling motes of dust in the air. I glanced around, not seeing anything at first, until I noticed something that looked like it was part of the wall. It was an old-fashioned trunk or chest, half buried against the wall. Curious, I pulled it forward, dragging it toward that window so I could see it better. It was battered, the hinges rusted, and it groaned a bit when I popped it open. Inside lay an assortment of objects, apparently from a time long gone. One item was a faded black and white photograph depicting an older couple. I froze as I realized I recognized them. The short, heavy-set man with overalls and the tall, thin woman with a severe expression and hooked nose. exactly like in my dreams. Beneath the photo was a piece of white fabric, a worn wedding dress, still resembling the same style I'd seen the woman wearing in my nightmares. At that moment, I became acutely aware of my surroundings. I was standing near the attic window, precisely where I dreamed of being pushed out numerous times. My stomach flipped as I imagined a hand on my back. The air felt charged, silent, and I could almost sense a presence right behind me. Fear flooded in, and I spun around, half expecting to see someone looming. Of course, no one was there, but that oppressive stillness weighed on me. Clutching the photograph in my hand, I hurried out of the attic, bounding down the stairs to meet my family. I didn't speak of what I found just then, too overwhelmed by the swirl of emotions. We left that day, and for a while the nightmares subsided. Perhaps the move disrupted whatever tie I had to that place. Over the next several years, I settled into a new routine, finished middle school and high school, then college. Life went on. I had occasionally recounted my nightmares to friends, turning the story into a ghost tale with some embellishments for dramatic effect. But at its core, the discovery of that photograph and wedding dress in the attic was real, and I never forgot it. 11 years slipped by before I found myself back in that small Midwestern town. I'd been away for college and then adult life, but an opportunity to visit arose, and I decided to spend some time poking around my old haunts, possibly unraveling the lingering mystery of that old house. The nightmares had ended, but the memory lingered, and I wanted closure. I still had that black and white photo. Something in me demanded answers about the couple whose faces were etched so deeply into my nightmares. Armed with the photograph, I went to the local library, hoping they had records that might help identify the house's previous owners. Libraries in small towns can be gold mines of local history. After some searching, I got lucky. A librarian helped me find property records and old newspapers. It turned out that an older couple indeed owned the house from the early 1900s to the 1950s. Diving deeper, I unearthed a few more details. Their 6-year-old son had died there under tragic circumstances. A fall from the 3rd floor. That was the same window from my nightmares, the same vantage point I'd replayed in my dreams. Further records indicated the woman later died of starvation in the attic, years after her son's death. I sat stunned, piecing it all together. The boy must have fallen from that very attic window, the same place I dreamed of being pushed. Could those night terrors have been echoes of that tragedy? The line between my own imagination and something more supernatural blurred. The old woman's cause of death, starvation in the attic, felt especially grim. Did she lose her mind after her son's passing? Did wearing her wedding gown signify something about her grief? Or was that garment simply the only article she had when she died? My mind buzzed with questions. Armed with this new context, I decided to do something bold. I wanted to see the house again. After a bit of hesitation, I drove across town to that old property. The place looked different from the outside, fresh paint, new flower beds, and a more modern fence. Still, it retained the same structure, the same shape that was burned into my mind from childhood. I parked out front, knocking on the door with some anxiety. I introduced myself as someone who lived there many years ago, feeling slightly embarrassed to show up unannounced. Surprisingly, the current owners greeted me warmly, talking about how they had renovated some rooms and wanted to show off their progress. The house's interior also looked updated. Walls were repainted, the floors redone. The couple proudly pointed out all the changes. As they talked, I recalled that my father years ago had converted a spare bedroom into a bathroom. The entrance to the attic was still through that bathroom closet, which seemed like an odd design, but it was how the house was built. I asked politely if I could use the bathroom, not wanting to mention my ulterior motive. They agreed. I stepped inside and shut the door behind me. Taking a moment to steady my nerves, I opened the closet door and carefully climbed into the attic. It felt surreal being back, especially with the house so different around it. The attic, though, seemed nearly the same. Still dusty, still an echo of the past. There were a few new boxes and storage bins, but in the shadows, I spotted the old trunk again. My stomach flipped with anticipation. I knelt down, slid the trunk out from the corner, and lifted its creaking lid. Inside, it looked just as I remembered. Personal mementos, random trinkets, the worn wedding dress. For a second, I wondered if I'd see any trace of my nightmares etched into the wood. Some sign that confirmed all those nights of terror. But everything was still. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the black and white photograph that I'd carried with me since I'd left at age 11. Holding it gently, I placed it back in the trunk, resting it on top of the dress exactly how I'd found it. A wave of emotion washed over me. Relief, sadness, maybe even gratitude. I gently closed the trunk's lid and took one final look around the attic, letting the memories sink in. I turned to go, giving the attic a soft goodbye, as if paying respect to the old couple I once believed haunted me. Then I made my way downstairs, thanked the owners for their time, and departed. Walking to my car, I felt an odd mixture of closure and lingering wonder. Part of me wanted to believe that the old couple had simply been lost souls, that perhaps they had latched on to me out of desperation or a need for comfort. Another part of me remained a pragmatist, questioning how much of my experience was shaped by childhood imagination, fueled by the stress of moving. But no matter what rational arguments I tried to muster, the memory of those vivid dreams, and the cuts and bruises that appeared without explanation, still sits in the back of my mind. The exact cause might remain ambiguous forever, but at least I found some form of resolution by returning the photograph and stepping away from the attic with a calmer heart. Now, years later, I'm no longer haunted by those nightmares. Sometimes I'll recall the old woman's face or the short man in overalls, but it doesn't grip me with fear anymore. I remember them with a peculiar sense of understanding, as though we had unfinished business that's now been concluded. That final moment in the attic, leaving the photo behind, served as my personal farewell. Maybe, in some intangible way, it was also a farewell for them, and they can finally rest. Or maybe they never needed that photo in the first place, and it was all a psychological anchor for me. Regardless, I'm at peace with what happened, content that I returned to my old home, found the trunk that started it all, and placed the photograph back where it belonged. I was about 10 years old at the time, living with my parents and my younger brother in California. My grandparents and my mom's siblings all lived in Texas, so we did this yearly travel arrangement. One year we'd go to see them, the next they'd visit us. This happened during the year they came over to California to stay for a couple of months. Specifically my grandparents, my two uncles, whom I'll call Jay and Luis, and my aunt, Ella. The thing about my aunt was that she was my age because my mom and grandmother were pregnant at the same time, a little fun fact in our family. Since my grandparents, uncles, and aunt would be around for a decent stretch, 2 months, my mom decided to rent them a small one-bedroom apartment on a month-to-month basis. It seemed perfect at the time. Cheap, conveniently located, and easy to move out of as soon as their visit ended. So they settled in, got themselves comfortable, and we started going over every day to spend time with them. Some nights, I'd even stay over, so I got pretty familiar with the place. My Aunt Ella and I liked running around outside the apartment complex, and we'd also play indoor hide-and-seek when the weather was too hot or if it was getting dark. Our favorite hiding spot ended up being the closet in the bedroom. It was a small walk-in closet, big enough for us to slip in together sometimes. There was a pull-chain light hanging from the ceiling, and the door closed just enough to block out all the light from the bedroom. We loved it, crouching there giggling while the other person wandered around, peeking under furniture or behind curtains. Anyway, one particular day changed everything. My Uncle Luis was sitting in the bedroom working on a broken radio, so he was by himself. The rest of us were probably in the living room or kitchen. At some point, he noticed out of the corner of his eye what looked like a pair of pale legs walking across the bedroom. Immediately, he assumed it was either me or Ella because the figure was childlike in height. The person was wearing olive green shorts, and my uncle caught just enough detail to guess it was a little girl. She headed straight to the bedroom closet and closed the door behind her. Uncle Luis didn't think much of it in that exact moment because he knew Ella and I were always using the closet as a hide-and-seek spot. Maybe we were trying to scare the other. But eventually, he wondered why we'd stay in there for so long without making a sound. He stood up, went to the closet, and opened it, fully expecting to find one of us stifling laughter inside. Only no one was there. Confused, he walked out to the living room. My mom, my grandma, my Uncle Jay, and the two of us kids were all there, sitting around talking or playing. Ella and I certainly hadn't been in the bedroom at all. All of us saw the color drain from Uncle Luis's face. He strode over to the front door, peeked out the little peephole, then turned back to face the rest of us. I remember that look of uncertainty, as if he wasn't sure how we'd react to what he needed to say. Finally, he blurted, "I just saw a ghost in the bedroom." Uncle Jay made a joke, guessing maybe he'd seen a rat or something, but Luis shook his head. "No, a ghost. She had these pale legs and green shorts. She went right into the closet." My mom and grandma tried to rationalize it, but once Luis explained himself, they realized Ella and I had been right in their line of sight the whole time. We'd never left the living room. The strangest part was that it happened early in the day. It wasn't nighttime or the typical spooky hour, but broad daylight that left no explanation for who or what walked into that closet. The next day, my mom and Luis happened to see the apartment manager standing around outside in the parking lot. My uncle decided to just go for it and ask the manager point blank if the apartment had a history of hauntings, or if anything unusual had happened there. The manager hesitated, looking nervous, but sensing our concern, he finally shared a story. He explained that the previous occupant of that very unit had been an older woman living there for quite some time. Neighbors complained often about her, saying she was loud, rude, and acted very strange. After she moved out, the staff went in to do their standard cleaning, expecting just the usual dirt or maybe a messed-up carpet. Instead, they found what appeared to be a shrine in the bedroom closet. The manager didn't describe it in detail, but he did mention there was a pig's head in the center. I never found out if it was a real pig's head or some prop, but either way, it was freaky. The manager said it looked like the woman had been practicing black magic or something similar. After she moved out, neighbors claimed they sometimes glimpsed shapes inside the empty apartment windows and heard weird noises at night. Supposedly, they even saw lights flick on and off when the place was vacant. The manager relaying this story was a sober, no-nonsense kind of guy. His seriousness made it hard to dismiss. Even so, my mom remained skeptical, and my uncle was caught between disbelief and genuine worry. He had, after all, seen that childlike figure, whoever or whatever it was. None of it felt made up anymore. The next thing I remember is that my grandmother lit white candles in every corner of the apartment. She's Mexican, and it's common in her tradition to do prayers in Spanish for spiritual cleansing. My grandma walked through each room, asking for protection and peace, waving a bit of incense around. I tagged along after her, watching the candlelight flicker against the walls, shadows dancing with every motion. My mind kept going back to that closet, remembering how many times Ella and I had hidden in there with the door shut, the overhead chain light turned off. I shuddered at the idea that the pale-legged figure might have been in there with us once or twice, unseen in the dark, or standing right behind us, waiting. Even though I was a child, I understood enough to be thoroughly spooked by the notion that some leftover presence from that woman's shrine might still occupy that closet. We stayed in that apartment for the remainder of their visit, though there was a definite shift in how comfortable we all felt. I recall that Ella and I never again used that closet for hide-and-seek. We avoided it, not explicitly acknowledging it, but each of us had a new wariness. In time, the 2 months ended, and my grandparents, uncles, and aunt headed back to Texas. We moved on with our lives. But the story didn't leave me. Over the years, I sometimes recall it and almost convince myself it was some half-baked memory or a child's dream. But every time, I realize how vividly I can still see my uncle's face going pale, how sure he was about witnessing that girl vanish into the closet. He's not one for tall tales, so if he says he saw it, I believe him. I wonder, did that figure want our attention? Was it a leftover shadow of the old woman's dark practices? Or maybe something else entirely, drawn to the negativity in that place? The manager's story about the pig's head, the black magic, and neighbors complaining about supernatural happenings never left me. Whenever I think about it, I picture the swirl of candle smoke as my grandma said her prayers, in Spanish, her voice steady as she tried to reclaim the apartment for light and warmth. The memory still makes me thankful I never actually saw the spirit with my own eyes. Hearing about it was unnerving enough. And to this day, if someone jokes about exploring a strange closet or messing with any voodoo-like paraphernalia, I get a little chill, remembering the day my uncle saw a ghost walk into a bedroom closet and vanish.